until he stopped forgiving.
I came home early from a fishing trip and found my wife fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. My son and his wife were sitting in the waiting room, perfectly calm as if nothing had happened. I immediately locked every bank account they had access to, and the panic that washed over their faces was something I will never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Martin Cole. I am 69 years old, and what I am about to tell you will change how you view the people closest to you. The sky over Lake Lanier was too gray for a good catch, so I packed my gear 2 days early. I just wanted to get back to my wife, Evelyn. We had built a quiet, comfortable life in our modest suburban home. I unlocked the front door expecting the familiar smell of her famous peach cobbler or the sound of her humming to old soul records. Instead, a suffocating silence greeted me. The house felt entirely empty. I walked into the kitchen and froze. A plastic orange pill bottle lay on its side near the island counter. The white pills were scattered across the polished hardwood floor. They were Evelyn heart medications. I knelt down, feeling a sudden tightness in my chest. Just yesterday morning, she had been standing right outside the kitchen window wearing her wide-brimmed straw hat, happily watering her hydrangeas. Her laugh had been strong and full of life when she kissed my cheek and told me to catch something big. Now her pills were treated like trash on the floor. Before I could process what I was looking at, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Atlanta General Hospital. A cold dread settled into my bones before I even answered. A clinical voice on the other end asked if I was Martin Cole. The woman informed me that my wife had been brought into the emergency room and was currently being stabilized in the intensive care unit. I dropped the fishing gear right on the porch and ran back to my truck. Evelyn and I had faced countless struggles together. We built a massive logistics empire from a single rusty delivery truck. We sold it years ago, choosing to live quietly on what appeared to be a standard pension, hiding our actual $12 million net worth in a private trust. We did this to keep our son grounded. I leaned on the horn, weaving through the crowded lanes, praying I would not be too late. The hospital entrance loomed ahead like a concrete fortress. I sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, ignoring the security guard who asked me to slow down. I demanded directions to the intensive care unit and took the stairs 2 at a time. When I pushed through the heavy double doors of the waiting area, I expected to see my family in a state of sheer panic. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. My 35-year-old son, Darren, was casually leaning back in a plastic chair, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. Beside him sat his white wife, Megan. She was crossing her legs perfectly, adjusting her expensive designer skirt and flipping through a glossy fashion magazine with absolute boredom. Neither of them looked distressed. Neither of them looked like they had a mother fighting for her life just down the hall. Darren finally looked up and noticed me standing there panting and sweating. He did not jump up to hug me. He simply lowered his coffee cup and gave me a flat, annoyed look. He asked what I was doing here and mentioned I was supposed to be at the lake until Sunday. I ignored his question and demanded to know what happened to Evelyn. Megan did not even bother to look up from her magazine when she casually stated that Evelyn had a little dizzy spell and passed out. She waved her hand dismissively, calling it a natural part of getting older. The sheer lack of empathy in her tone made my blood boil. I asked them exactly how long they had been waiting here. Darren checked his luxury watch, a piece he bought using the supplementary credit card I generously provided him. He nonchalantly replied that the ambulance brought her in about 4 hours ago. 4 hours. My wife had been in the hospital for 4 hours, and my own son had not bothered to pick up the phone to call me. I asked him point blank why he kept me in the dark. Darren rolled his eyes and sighed heavily. He claimed he did not want to ruin my fishing trip over a minor fainting spell. A minor fainting spell does not land a person in the intensive care unit. The math did not add up. The casual attitude did not fit the sterile, terrifying environment of the critical care ward. They were treating this like a minor inconvenience, like waiting for a delayed flight. I stared at the two of them, realizing that the boy I had raised to respect family above all else had turned into a cold, calculating stranger. Megan finally closed her magazine with a loud snap and complained about the hospital coffee being bitter. She asked Darren if they could leave soon because they had dinner reservations at an upscale steakhouse. My wife was lying in a hospital bed attached to monitors, and my daughter-in-law was worried about missing a dinner reservation. I stepped closer to Darren, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I told him he was not going anywhere until a doctor looked me in the eye and told me my wife was safe. Darren stood up, trying to use his height to intimidate me, but I did not flinch. He told me to calm down and stop making a scene in public. He said I was overreacting. I felt a sudden urge to grab him by his tailored collar, but the heavy sound of a door opening interrupted us. A doctor in green scrubs walked into the waiting area holding a clipboard. His face was grim, entirely contradicting the relaxed narrative Darren and Megan had just tried to sell me. The doctor asked for the family of Evelyn Cole. I stepped forward, immediately identifying myself as her husband. The doctor introduced himself as Dr. Evans and asked us to step into a private consultation room. Darren and Megan followed me inside, though Megan let out a loud theatrical sigh as if this were a massive waste of her valuable time. Dr. Evans did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked directly at me and stated that Evelyn had suffered a severe respiratory failure. My heart plummeted into my stomach. I told him about her heart condition, assuming her medication had failed. Dr. Evans shook his head firmly. He explained that her heart was perfectly fine. Her collapse was not caused by any underlying medical condition. He reviewed the initial toxicology screen and confirmed that Evelyn had ingested a high dose of a hazardous chemical toxin. The room fell entirely silent. A toxin. The word echoed in my mind like a gunshot. Somebody had poisoned my wife. Before I could ask a single question, Darren suddenly stepped forward and raised his voice. He aggressively pointed his finger at me, telling the doctor that I was always leaving dangerous cleaning supplies and garden chemicals around the kitchen. He loudly proclaimed that I was careless and that Evelyn had probably mistaken a cup of liquid fertilizer for her morning tea because she was getting senile. I stared at my son in absolute disbelief. He was actively trying to frame me for his mother-critical condition. Evelyn was not senile. She was sharp, brilliant, and meticulous. She would never drink a random chemical. Darren was laying down a narrative to protect himself. He was shifting the blame with an ease that terrified me. Megan immediately chimed in, supporting her husband. She told the doctor that they had been telling me for months that Evelyn needed to be put in an assisted living facility because our house was no longer safe for her. The sheer audacity of their lies paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. They were using my wife tragedy to build a case for her incompetence. The door to the consultation room opened again. 2 uniformed police officers walked in. The doctor had called them the moment the toxicology report came back positive for a foreign substance. One of the officers stepped forward holding a notepad. He stated that they needed to take official statements from everyone in the room regarding the events leading up to Mrs. Cole ingesting a toxic substance. Darren looked at me with a smug, calculated expression, fully prepared to throw me to the wolves. The older police officer clicked his ballpoint pen and asked who had last seen Evelyn before the ambulance arrived. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Megan stepped forward. She placed her manicured hand on her chest, adopting a tone of deep, sorrowful concern. She told the officer that Evelyn had been struggling with her memory for months. Megan claimed my wife constantly forgot where she put her house keys, routinely left the kitchen stove burner running, and regularly confused her daily vitamins with her blood pressure medication. She painted a pathetic, detailed picture of a frail, senile old woman who accidentally poisoned herself simply because her mind was failing her. I stood there listening to this blatant character assassination. My wife did not have a failing mind. Evelyn was the chief financial officer of our massive logistics company for 30 years. She personally negotiated multi-million-dollar freight contracts with aggressive union leaders. She navigated complex corporate tax codes, managed the weekly payroll for over 200 long-haul drivers, and spotted billing discrepancies that our professional auditors consistently missed. Even after we sold the trucking fleet, Evelyn handled our entire household portfolio with ruthless precision. Just last week, she caught a bank error regarding a miscalculated interest yield on a municipal bond. Her brain was a steel trap. Yet here was my daughter-in-law, a woman who struggled to balance a basic monthly credit card statement, confidently telling a police officer that Evelyn was losing her grip on reality. Darren nodded along with his wife, adding that they had been trying to convince me to put his mother in a specialized care facility for her own safety. He looked at the officer with fake pity and stated I was simply a stubborn old man in deep denial about my wife's deteriorating mental state. I kept my voice perfectly level. I did not raise my tone. I looked the officer directly in the eye and stated for the official record that my wife possessed zero history of cognitive decline. I informed him that she managed our finances daily and that anyone suggesting she accidentally drank industrial poison was feeding him a fabricated narrative. The officer paused, his eyes shifting between my cold stare and Darren, forced look of concern. He scribbled rapidly in his notebook, sensing the heavy hostility radiating across the room. He asked for a full inventory of all household chemicals. I provided a precise list, emphasizing that all gardening and cleaning supplies were locked in a detached shed that Evelyn never visited. Megan shifted her weight uncomfortably. She realized her senility narrative was hitting a solid wall of undisputed facts. Our tense standoff was interrupted by a woman in a tailored gray suit holding a digital tablet. She introduced herself as the hospital billing coordinator. She apologized for the intrusion but stated that the intensive care unit and the specialized toxicology treatments required immediate administrative processing. She needed my signature on the financial liability forms and an upfront deposit to cover the expensive out-of-network laboratory tests they were running to identify the exact poison. I nodded, stepping away from the officers and my treacherous family. I walked over to the administrative desk at the far end of the hallway. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my banking application. Evelyn and I kept our massive wealth entirely shielded in a private trust, but we maintained a joint savings account at a local commercial bank for daily household expenses and unforeseen medical emergencies. We purposely kept exactly $50,000 in that specific account. It was our reliable safety net for rainy days, instantly accessible at a moment's notice. I tapped the screen to initiate a transfer to my checking account so I could hand the coordinator my debit card. The screen loaded. A small white circle spun in the center of the display. When the numbers finally appeared, I froze. I blinked, assuming my eyes were playing tricks on me under the harsh fluorescent hospital lights. The available balance read $0.00. I closed the application entirely. I disconnected from the hospital wireless network, assuming a glitch in the connection was displaying outdated information. I reloaded the application using my cellular data. I typed in my password again. The screen refreshed. The bold black numbers remained unchanged. $0. The $50,000 we had deposited just last month was completely gone. The billing coordinator cleared her throat politely, tapping her stylus against her tablet. She asked if there was a problem with my payment method. I held up my hand, signaling for a moment of patience. A cold, heavy realization began to settle in my stomach, replacing the immediate panic with a chilling clarity. Money does not simply vanish from a secure joint account. Money is moved. Money is taken. I tapped on the account details to view the recent activity. I needed to see exactly where that money went. My hands did not shake. The initial shock had already morphed into a razor-sharp focus. I scrolled past the grocery store purchases and the utility bill payments from earlier in the week. Right at the top of the ledger, a new entry mocked me. It was a wire transfer. It had cleared the bank system with brutal efficiency. I looked closely at the exact timestamp on the wire transfer. The transaction was initiated and completed exactly 4 hours and 15 minutes ago. I did the math in my head. That was the precise window of time when the paramedics were loading my dying wife into the back of an ambulance. Someone had logged into our joint account while Evelyn was suffocating on the kitchen floor and drained every single penny. I looked at the destination account listed on the digital receipt. It was transferred directly to a personal checking account registered to Darren Cole, my own son. He did not just ignore my phone calls while his mother was fighting for her life. He actively utilized the chaos of her medical emergency to steal her safety net. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I turned away from the billing coordinator and walked slowly back to the waiting area. Darren was still standing near the police officer, playing the role of the traumatized family member. Megan was holding his arm, putting on a sickening display of spousal support. I walked straight up to him. I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I simply asked him why he transferred $50,000 out of his mother account while she was fighting for her breath. The police officer immediately stopped writing and looked up. Megan dropped her hand from Darren's arm as if she had been burned by fire. Darren's face flushed a deep, guilty red, but he recovered his composure with sickening speed. He squared his shoulders and loudly proclaimed that his mother had promised him that money a week ago. He claimed he had a time-sensitive real estate investment opportunity regarding a commercial property flip, and that Evelyn explicitly told him to take the funds today. He manufactured a look of deep offense. He raised his voice so the nurses at the nearby station could hear him clearly. He accused me of being petty and paranoid. He demanded to know how I could possibly care about a simple bank transfer when his mother was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. He tried to shame me in front of the authorities. He tried to paint me as a greedy old man obsessing over cash during a family tragedy. But his loud, righteous indignation could not hide the rapid pulse beating in his neck. He needed that money desperately. He knew I had caught him red-handed. He used the excuse of a pre-approved investment to cover up an opportunistic theft. I stared at him, letting his hollow words hang in the sterile hospital air. I realized right then that the boy I raised was gone. He was replaced by a ruthless predator. And predators only understand one thing. They only understand power. I did not waste another breath arguing with a man who had already justified his own treachery. I simply turned my back on his theatrical performance. I politely informed the billing coordinator that I needed a brief moment to use the restroom before processing the initial payment. I walked away with measured steps, feeling the heavy stares of the police officers and my deceitful son burning into my back. I pushed through the heavy wooden door of the men's restroom and immediately slid the deadbolt into place. I walked over to the porcelain sink and gripped the cold edges, breathing deeply to steady my racing heart. I turned on the faucet, letting the icy water run over my trembling hands. I splashed my face, forcing the image of my dying wife out of my immediate thoughts so I could focus purely on survival. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a prepaid cellular phone. Evelyn had always insisted we keep a secure, unregistered line for extreme corporate emergencies back when we ran the logistics company. She knew better than anyone that digital footprints could be weaponized by hostile competitors. Today, our most hostile competitor was standing right outside in the waiting room. I dialed the private direct line of Arthur Pierce. Arthur was the ruthless corporate attorney who had meticulously structured the sale of our trucking fleet a decade ago. He was a brilliant white man who understood the value of absolute financial secrecy. Darren genuinely believed that the $50,000 he had just stolen represented the vast majority of our liquid assets. He operated under the assumption that his mother and I were surviving on standard retirement pensions and Social Security checks. He thought he had successfully crippled us with one swift transaction. My son had absolutely no idea that our actual net worth exceeded $12 million. Following the sale of our empire, Evelyn and I had placed our fortune into an irrevocable blind trust completely insulated from any external inquiries. The account Darren had drained was merely our petty cash fund designated for household groceries and minor medical co-payments. I listened to the phone ring twice before Arthur answered with his usual crisp professionalism. I did not bother with pleasantries. I gave him a rapid situation report stating clearly that Evelyn was in the intensive care unit suffering from suspected chemical poisoning. I informed Arthur that Darren had just drained our secondary joint account while his mother was suffocating on our kitchen floor. Arthur remained dead silent for a fraction of a second before shifting instantly into a tactical mindset. I issued a series of rapid-fire directives with the exact same authority I used to command hundreds of freight dispatchers. I ordered Arthur to immediately cancel and freeze every single supplementary credit card attached to our primary accounts. For the past 3 years, I had quietly tolerated Darren and Meg's extravagant lifestyle. I allowed them to hold 3 platinum credit cards under my name. They used those cards to fund their lavish weekend getaways, expensive dinners, and designer clothing purchases. I paid those exorbitant statements at the end of every month, simply to keep peace in the family, and to ensure my son never felt inadequate. That peace treaty was now officially terminated. I told Arthur to sever their financial oxygen supply without warning. Next, I instructed him to place a hard legal lock on the deed to our primary residence and to set up an aggressive fraud alert on our entire property portfolio. Darren possessed physical copies of our old house documents from years ago when he helped us organize our filing cabinets. Knowing his current desperation, I suspected he might try to leverage those outdated documents to secure emergency loans or illicit mortgages. Arthur typed furiously on his keyboard, confirming my instructions. He warned me that initiating a sudden total financial freeze across multiple banking institutions would instantly trigger automated text message alerts on Darren's personal devices. Arthur cautioned that my son would know immediately that his financial lifeline had been violently severed. I told Arthur that was exactly the reaction I wanted to provoke. A predator stripped of its resources will inevitably panic. When greedy people panic, they act impulsively and they make monumental mistakes. I wanted Darren to feel the immediate sting of his actions. I wanted him to realize that the safety net he had taken for granted his entire adult life was gone forever. Arthur confirmed the total lockdown would be fully active within 60 seconds. He promised to assemble his legal team and await my next command. I hung up the prepaid phone and slipped it safely back into my hidden pocket. I grabbed a paper towel and dried my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. The grieving, terrified husband was gone. The founder of a transportation empire stared back at me. I unlocked the restroom door and stepped back out into the sterile, bright hallway of the hospital, perfectly prepared for the impending collision. I took a seat in the corner of the waiting room, far away from where the police officers were still questioning Megan. I folded my arms and watched the digital clock on the wall tick forward. Exactly 7 minutes later, the hallway doors violently burst open. Darren marched through them with a face flushed tight with pure, unadulterated rage. He was clutching a small plastic tray containing an overpriced artisan sandwich and an artisanal coffee from the premium hospital cafeteria downstairs. He spotted me immediately and stormed across the waiting area, closing the distance with aggressive, heavy steps. He forced his furious expression into a mask of panicked desperation as he approached the main nurse station. He slammed the plastic tray onto a nearby table, making sure every nurse and passing doctor looked in our direction. Darren raised his voice, projecting the image of a deeply devoted son pushed to his absolute breaking point by a difficult parent. He shouted that the bank had just put a massive fraud alert on his platinum credit card simply because he was trying to buy his distressed wife a quick meal. He complained loudly that the banking algorithm must have flagged the hospital location as a suspicious geographical anomaly. He marched directly up to my chair and aggressively held out his open palm. He demanded that I hand over my primary debit card right this second. He lied effortlessly through his teeth, projecting his voice so the remaining police officer could hear every word. Darren claimed he desperately needed my card to pay the urgent toxicology deposit for his mother life-saving treatment. He painted a masterful picture of a dutiful child begging a confused, useless father to step up and help save his mother's life. He tried to corner me, utilizing public shame as a weapon to force compliance. He expected me to blindly hand over my wallet to avoid causing a humiliating scene in front of the medical staff. I remained entirely seated. I did not hand him my wallet. I looked up at him with absolute ice running through my veins. I knew he was lying about the medical deposit because the billing coordinator was still waiting for me at the administrative desk. I knew exactly why his platinum card had bounced at the cafeteria register. He had tried to buy an overpriced lunch using a credit line I had just permanently destroyed. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and told him I would not give him a single dime. I told him he could use the $50,000 he had just wired into his personal account to buy his wife her lunch. Darren jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would shatter, but he could not say another word without exposing his theft to the entire room. Darren recognized that public intimidation had completely failed to force me into handing over my debit card. He smoothly pivoted his strategy, instantly dropping the aggressive posture and adopting the persona of a hyper-efficient, deeply concerned son. He unzipped his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He stepped back into my personal space and shoved a heavy luxury pen into my hand. He flipped open the folder to reveal a stack of dense text-heavy documents. He stated that the hospital administration needed these liability waivers signed immediately so the specialist could begin administering the broad-spectrum antidotes for his mother. He tapped his finger impatiently at the bottom of the first page. He urged me to just sign the bottom lines quickly, claiming the legal jargon was standard hospital policy. He added a patronizing comment about my allegedly failing eyesight, suggesting that reading the fine print would only give me a headache and delay Evelyn from receiving her critical care. He tried to physically flip the page for me, treating me like a helpless child who simply needed to follow basic instructions. He severely miscalculated his opponent. Darren had spent his entire adult life coasting on the wealth his mother and I provided, but he never actually understood how we built that wealth. For 30 uninterrupted years, I sat at the head of a sprawling mahogany boardroom table. I personally dismantled and scrutinized thousands of complex commercial freight contracts, aggressive labor union agreements, and high-stakes corporate acquisition documents. I trained my eyes and my brain to hunt down the hidden traps buried deep within the absolute smallest fine print. Opposing lawyers routinely tried to slip disadvantageous clauses past me, and I caught them every single time. My physical vision might require prescription reading glasses these days, but my analytical mind remains an impenetrable steel trap. I did not blindly sign the paper. I gripped the manila folder firmly with both hands and pulled it away from his hovering fingers. I told him I never sign a single contract without understanding the exact terms of my liability. Darren's jaw clenched and a flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He tried to reach for the folder again, insisting that time was running out for his mother. I ignored him and began to slowly turn the pages. The first two documents were standard medical disclosures. The paper was thin, cheap hospital stock. However, as my thumb slid down the stack to the third page, I felt a distinct difference in the texture. The paper was heavy premium legal stock. It did not belong in a medical billing packet. I shifted the top pages slightly to expose the hidden document. Nestled perfectly between the standard privacy disclosure and the surgical liability waiver was a fully drafted legal contract bearing the official seal of the state. It was a full, durable financial and medical power of attorney. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense paragraphs. The document was meticulously designed to grant Darren complete, unrestricted legal authority over my entire life. The clauses explicitly authorized him to liquidate my financial assets, sell my real estate properties, empty my bank accounts, and make ultimate life-or-death medical decisions on my behalf. Darren had not just printed this in a panic. This required a lawyer. This required premeditation. He had brought this document to the hospital fully intending to trick me into signing away my independence and my fortune while I was paralyzed by the grief of losing my wife. A surge of pure, lethal rage ignited in my chest. The urge to wrap my hands around his tailored collar and throw him through the hospital window was nearly overwhelming. I brutally suppressed that instinct. I recognized that a physical altercation would only validate his false narrative, that I was an unstable, dangerous old man. I needed to destroy his weapon without breaking my cover. I leaned into the exact role he had assigned me. I let my hands begin to violently tremble. I took short, erratic breaths, perfectly mimicking the symptoms of an elderly man succumbing to severe panic and emotional exhaustion. I reached out for a large styrofoam cup of ice water resting on the small table next to my chair. I fumbled with the heavy pen and the folder in one hand while blindly grasping the cup with the other. I allowed my shaking fingers to deliberately collide with the side of the cup. The container tipped over instantly. A massive wave of freezing water and crushed ice cascaded directly onto the open folder. The icy flood pooled heavily over the thick legal paper of the power of attorney. The cheap printer ink immediately bled across the page, transforming the malicious legal clauses into a dark, illegible blur. The water soaked through the official notary seal, dissolving the stamp entirely. Darren let out a sharp, furious gasp. He lunged forward and desperately tried to snatch the document out of the puddle. He pulled the heavy paper too aggressively, and the soaked contract tore cleanly in half, completely ruining its legal validity. I unleashed a torrent of frantic, breathless apologies. I kept my voice high and wavering, playing the devastated husband to absolute perfection. I repeatedly blamed my shaking hands and my overwhelming fear for Evelyn. I meticulously separated the torn, soaking wet pieces of the ruined power of attorney from the rest of the stack. I dropped the useless, soggy mess directly into the nearby trash can, ensuring it could never be salvaged or taped back together. I then picked up the actual hospital forms. They were slightly damp around the edges, but perfectly legible. My trembling completely vanished the second the pen touched the paper. I signed my name with firm, aggressive precision on the medical waivers. I handed the surviving documents back to my son. Darren stood there staring at the garbage can with a look of utter devastation. His golden ticket to my entire fortune was currently soaking in the trash. Megan's face twisted into an ugly mask of absolute fury. She glared at me, her chest heaving with contained anger, but she was entirely trapped. She could not scream or throw a tantrum in the middle of a crowded intensive care waiting room without exposing her own vile intentions. She stepped uncomfortably close to Darren and grabbed his arm. She leaned into his shoulder and her voice dropped to a sharp, venomous whisper. She told him the hospital was a waste of time now and they needed to urgently regroup. She explicitly instructed him to drive them back to my house immediately. She whispered that they needed to pack their overnight bags and secure the original checkbooks, the physical property deeds, and the metal safe keys before I eventually went home. She commanded him to gain physical control of the house while I was stuck waiting for the doctors. They turned and walked rapidly toward the exit doors without a single glance back at the ward where Evelyn was fighting for her life. I watched their retreating figures, processing every word Megan had just hissed. The battlefield had officially shifted. My house was their next target. All of Evelyn, personal belongings, our physical security boxes, and the tangible evidence of our life together were sitting unguarded in that residence. I realized I could not stay in the waiting room. I had secured Evelyn medical care, but I had to beat those two predators to my own front door. I turned to the nearest police officer and the attending nurse, keeping my voice steady and deliberately soft. I told them I needed to return to my house immediately to retrieve Evelyn's comprehensive medical history file and her thick wool cardigan because she always felt freezing after waking up from heavy sedation. The officer nodded, offering a sympathetic look completely unaware of the ruthless war happening right under his nose. I did not wait for Darren and Megan to exit the cafeteria and realize I was gone. I walked briskly through the automatic sliding doors of the emergency room and flagged down a waiting taxi. I handed the driver a crisp $50 bill and instructed him to take the fastest route to my suburban neighborhood, aggressively bypassing the main highway traffic. I needed to beat my treacherous son to my own front door. The ride felt agonizingly slow. I stared out the window, calculating the minutes with cold precision. Darren drove a high-performance sports car, but I knew he would have to wait for his furious wife to stop complaining and walk to the hospital parking garage. That gave me a crucial 15-minute head start. I instructed the taxi driver to drop me off 2 blocks away from my property. I did not want my arrival announced by flashing headlights or the loud sound of an idling engine. I walked the remaining distance through the familiar neighborhood, staying hidden close to the thick oak trees lining the sidewalk. The night air was cool, but angry sweat gathered at the back of my neck. My house stood completely dark at the end of the cul-de-sac. I approached the front porch, pulling my keys from my pocket. As I slid the brass key into the deadbolt, my hand stopped completely. The metal plate surrounding the keyhole was deeply scratched. Fresh, jagged silver lines scored the dark brass finish. The lock cylinder felt strangely loose when I turned it. Someone had not simply used a spare key to enter. Someone had aggressively forced this lock open using professional picking tools or a bump key. This was not a casual visit from a family member checking on the property. This was a calculated, forceful break-in that had occurred long before tonight. They wanted to ensure they had unrestricted access regardless of whether I changed the locks. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the foyer. The air inside felt stagnant, wrong, completely violated. The faint smell of Megan's expensive floral perfume hung in the hallway, completely replacing the warm scent of Evelyn's baking. I did not bother turning on the hallway lights. I knew every inch of this floor plan by heart. I moved silently past the dark kitchen and headed straight down the corridor toward the master bedroom. My primary objective was to secure the hidden floor safe tucked beneath the baseboards under the heavy oak armoire. That safe held our original birth certificates, the physical property deeds, and the master ledger of our offshore blind trust. I pushed the bedroom door open and froze completely in my tracks. The moonlight filtering through the blinds illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The room had been entirely stripped of Evelyn. Her presence was systematically erased. The handmade floral quilt she cherished had been violently ripped off the mattress and replaced by a cold, modern gray duvet. The bedside tables were cleared of her reading glasses and her favorite brass lamp. I stepped further inside, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Tucked into the far corner of the room, stacked haphazardly against the custom molding, were 6 large, heavy-duty moving boxes. I walked over and aggressively tore open the interlocking flaps of the top carton. Inside, packed away like worthless garbage destined for a charity bin, were Evelyn's most intimate belongings. I saw her framed family photographs tossed face down. I saw her polished wooden jewelry box shoved carelessly beneath a pile of her vintage soul vinyl records. Her soft knitted sweaters were crushed at the bottom. A profound, suffocating wave of violation washed over me. I built this exact house with my own bare hands 40 years ago. Before the massive logistics empire, before the millions of dollars in the bank, I poured the concrete foundation and framed these very walls during the sweltering Georgia summers. I drove nails into these floorboards until my fingers bled to ensure my wife would always have an impenetrable sanctuary. This master bedroom was our sacred space, the only place where we could truly rest. Now my own flesh and blood had brutally evicted her memory from it while she lay suffocating in a hospital bed attached to a ventilator. Darren did not just want our money. He wanted to entirely replace our existence with his own. He was forcefully claiming his inheritance while his mother was still drawing breath. This was an occupation. I dropped to my knees beside the armoire and pulled back the edge of the Persian rug. I pried up the false floorboard. The heavy steel door of the hidden safe remained securely locked. The digital keypad showed no signs of tampering. They had stripped the room of the visible items, but they lacked the specific knowledge to find the true vault. I let out a sharp, quiet breath of relief. My financial leverage remained entirely intact. They could steal the loose cash, but the real power was buried in concrete and steel right beneath my feet. I stood back up and turned my attention toward the massive walk-in closet on the opposite side of the room to assess the full extent of their invasion. I stepped toward the walk-in closet and firmly gripped the brass handle. I slid the heavy mirrored doors open, and a fresh wave of disgust hit me. My modest button-down shirts and Evelyn's elegant dresses were completely gone. In their place hung a sickening display of unearned luxury. Darren's custom-tailored Italian suits lined the racks next to Megan's high-end designer dresses and row upon row of expensive leather handbags. They did not just pack overnight bags as Megan had whispered in the hospital. They had fully moved into our master bedroom days, or even weeks ago while we were away at the lake. They had literally taken over our bed. I backed out of the closet feeling physically sick. My eyes fell on Evelyn's antique vanity table near the window. The beautiful glass surface was cluttered with a chaotic mess of expensive cosmetics, discarded jewelry, and loose makeup brushes belonging to Megan. But sitting right in the center of the glass, completely out of place among the perfumes, was a small clear plastic bottle. It looked exactly like a standard container for eye drops, but the generic factory label had been deliberately peeled off, leaving sticky residue behind. I walked over and picked it up. The plastic yielded slightly under my thumb. I twisted the white cap off and brought the nozzle close to my face. A harsh, acrid chemical scent hit my nostrils immediately. It smelled like highly concentrated rubbing alcohol mixed with something distinctly metallic and sharp. This was not saline solution. This was not a cosmetic product. This was the exact weapon used to put my wife in the intensive care unit. Suddenly, the heavy crunch of gravel in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Bright LED headlights swept across the bedroom wall, casting long, frantic shadows across the floor. I heard the distinct, aggressive rumble of Darren's luxury sedan parking right outside my front door. Car doors slammed shut with urgency. I immediately shoved the chemical bottle deep into the inner pocket of my jacket. I could not let them trap me inside this room and discover I knew their secret. I stepped swiftly out of the bedroom, moved silently down the back hallway, and slipped quietly out the rear patio door just as I heard the front deadbolt begin to turn. I disappeared into the dark shadows of my own backyard, armed with the physical proof of their treachery. I stood silently behind the large oak tree, watching the lights flick on inside my own home as the intruders began their frantic search for the checkbooks I had already locked away. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I arrived back at Atlanta General Hospital just as the morning shift change was occurring. The air smelled strongly of industrial bleach and stale coffee. I bypassed the main elevators and took the secondary stairwell to the intensive care unit, moving with quiet purpose. As I pushed open the heavy fire door to the third floor, I immediately spotted Darren standing near the nurses' station. He was not alone. He was engaged in an intense, hushed conversation with a tall man wearing a white lab coat over a conservative suit. The ID badge clipped to the man lapel clearly identified him as the hospital-on-call psychiatric evaluator. I stopped completely still behind a large structural pillar, ensuring I was entirely out of their line of sight. I listened as Darren spoke in a voice dripping with manufactured distress. He told the psychiatrist that I had been exhibiting severe paranoid delusions for the past 6 months. He claimed I frequently wandered the neighborhood in the middle of the night, incapable of remembering my own address. Darren stated that the trauma of Evelyn's sudden illness had completely shattered my fragile grip on reality. He aggressively asserted that I was an immediate danger to myself, and more importantly, entirely unfit to make critical medical decisions for my wife. The strategy was brutally transparent. Darren was executing the preliminary steps to legally strip me of my medical guardianship over Evelyn. If he successfully convinced the hospital staff that I was mentally incompetent, the administrative authority over Evelyn medical care would default directly to him as her next of kin. He would hold the absolute power to dictate her treatments, access her private medical records, and potentially authorize the withdrawal of life-saving measures. My son was methodically building a legal framework to sideline me, paving the way for total control over his mother's fate. The psychiatrist nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes on a small clipboard. He thanked Darren for bringing his concerns to the hospital attention and promised to conduct an immediate informal assessment of my cognitive state. I remained behind the pillar, perfectly controlling my breathing. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The trap was set. If I walked out into that hallway and unleashed the fury I was currently feeling, I would validate every single lie Darren had just told. If I shouted, cursed, or exhibited any aggressive behavior, the psychiatrist would instantly document me as an emotionally volatile, unstable, elderly man experiencing a psychotic break. I would hand Darren the exact ammunition he needed to secure temporary medical conservatorship. I consciously forced every muscle in my body to relax. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket and stepped out from behind the pillar, walking toward Evelyn's room with a slow, measured, perfectly calm stride. Darren spotted me instantly. He nudged the psychiatrist, pointing discreetly in my direction. The tall doctor turned and approached me, adopting a deliberately soothing, non-threatening tone. He introduced himself as Dr. Harrison and asked if I had a few moments to discuss my wife's condition. I stopped and offered a polite, weary smile. I told him I always had time to discuss Evelyn care. Dr. Harrison began his assessment with seemingly casual conversation, asking about my drive to the hospital and whether I had managed to get any sleep. I answered his questions with mundane, grounded facts. I noted the specific traffic patterns on Interstate 85 and mentioned the exact brand of coffee I had brewed before leaving the house. Dr. Harrison then shifted his line of questioning toward more complex cognitive indicators. He asked me to recall the specific details of Evelyn's collapse and her subsequent medical interventions. I recognized the test immediately. He was probing for any signs of confusion, memory gaps, or paranoid fabrications. I looked Dr. Harrison directly in the eye and delivered a flawless clinical recounting of the previous 24 hours. I did not mention Darren theft or the forced entry into my home. I focused entirely on the medical data. I provided the exact name and dosage of the 3 cardiac medications Evelyn had been taking for the past 4 years. I detailed her recent blood pressure readings, reciting the systolic and diastolic numbers from her last 3 cardiology appointments with perfect accuracy. I calmly explained that Dr. Evans, the attending physician, had confirmed a severe respiratory failure triggered by an unidentified chemical toxin, explicitly ruling out any underlying cardiovascular events. I presented the facts with the detached precision of a seasoned logistics executive delivering a quarterly board report. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a shred of emotional instability. Dr. Harrison stopped taking notes. The professional skepticism in his eyes was rapidly replaced by genuine professional respect. He realized he was not speaking to a confused, rambling old man. He was speaking to a sharp, highly observant individual who possessed a total command of the situation. Dr. Harrison closed his clipboard and offered a sincere, reassuring smile. He told me that my detailed recall was incredibly helpful for the medical team. He explicitly stated that I was handling this immense stress with remarkable clarity and resilience. The psychiatric trap had snapped completely shut empty. I glanced over Dr. Harrison's shoulder and locked eyes with Darren. My son's face was a mask of furious disbelief. His entire narrative of my mental decline had been effortlessly dismantled in less than 5 minutes. Darren clenched his jaw, recognizing that his attempt to seize medical control had failed spectacularly. However, before I could fully savor the tactical victory, Megan rounded the corner from the elevator bank. She marched directly up to Darren, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. She ignored me entirely and shoved her smartphone directly into her husband's chest. She did not bother to lower her voice. Megan loudly declared that the hospital was a waste of time because they had a much more urgent problem to deal with immediately. She hissed that the exclusive listing agent she had hired to sell my house had just encountered a massive legal roadblock. Megan had escalated the war, moving from medical sabotage straight to real estate fraud. I left the hospital and navigated my truck through the midday traffic toward my neighborhood. My primary objective was to retrieve Evelyn's favorite silk robe and a selection of her personal hygiene items to make her intensive care unit stay marginally more comfortable. The fierce adrenaline from dismantling Darren's psychiatric trap still coursed through my veins, but my mind remained entirely focused on the immediate tactical situation. I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street and slowed my vehicle to a crawl. A sleek silver luxury sedan was parked directly in my driveway. A woman wearing a sharp, tailored navy blazer and designer sunglasses was standing squarely in the middle of my meticulously manicured front lawn. She held a heavy wooden mallet in her right hand. With aggressive rhythmic strikes, she drove a thick wooden stake deep into my grass. Attached to the top of the stake was a massive glossy real estate sign featuring her beaming face and the bold words, "Exclusive listing." I parked my truck on the street and stepped out onto the pavement. A cold wave of disbelief washed over me. I walked slowly up my own driveway, staring at the blatant violation of my property. The title to this house rested entirely in my name and Evelyn's name. We paid off the final mortgage installment 2 decades ago when our logistics company secured its first national freight contract. The only reason Darren possessed any physical documentation regarding this property was due to a specific safety measure Evelyn implemented 10 years ago. During a severe hurricane season, my highly organized wife insisted on compiling an emergency binder containing photocopies of our essential deeds and insurance policies. She entrusted that specific binder to our son, demanding he keep it secured in a fireproof lockbox in case our primary residence suffered catastrophic weather damage. Darren had taken that sacred emergency binder and weaponized it against us. He handed our private property records directly to his wife to facilitate an illegal real estate transaction. I approached the woman on my lawn. I kept my posture relaxed and intentionally rounded my shoulders slightly to project the image of a harmless, tired old man. I politely cleared my throat and asked her what she was doing in my yard. The woman jumped slightly, dropping the mallet into the grass. She quickly recovered her bright professional smile and stepped forward, extending a perfectly manicured hand. She introduced herself as Valerie, a premium real estate broker specializing in expedited luxury sales. She spoke to me in that distinct, loudly pitched, and agonizingly slow tone that arrogant people reserve for toddlers or the elderly. She patted my arm condescendingly and explained that she was simply finalizing the marketing preparations for the upcoming open house. I looked at the large sign bearing her smiling face and asked her who exactly authorized the sale of my property. Valerie adjusted her designer sunglasses and adopted a look of rehearsed corporate sympathy. She explained that she was working directly under the exclusive instructions of my daughter-in-law, Megan Cole. Valerie proudly detailed how Megan had contacted her agency early this morning demanding an aggressive cash-only sale. I asked Valerie why my daughter-in-law would demand such a rushed transaction for a house she did not own. The broker tilted her head, offering me a sickeningly sweet smile filled with fake compassion. She stated that Megan had been completely transparent about my unfortunate medical situation. Valerie explained that the family was dealing with a profound tragedy regarding my rapid and severe cognitive decline. According to Megan's narrative, I was suffering from advanced dementia and could no longer safely inhabit a 2-story home. Valerie loudly articulated that the family desperately needed to liquidate this real estate asset immediately to secure my placement in a high-end luxury assisted living facility. I stood on my own front lawn listening to a total stranger recite the fictional tragedy of my failing mind. Megan had not merely escalated her attacks to real estate fraud. She had actively weaponized the very concept of my humanity to bypass standard legal verification protocols. She sold this broker a compelling sob story about a burdensome father-in-law to justify an illegal, expedited property listing. Valerie continued her cheerful monologue, assuring me that Megan had chosen the best agency in the city to ensure I would have plenty of money for my new nursing home. She reached into her expensive leather tote bag and pulled out a stack of glossy promotional flyers featuring high-resolution photographs of my living room and kitchen. They had clearly staged and photographed my home while Evelyn and I were out of town on our fishing trip. The sheer audacity of their home invasion threatened to break my carefully constructed facade. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to rip the wooden stake out of the ground and throw this trespassing broker off my property. I brutally suppressed that violent urge. I recognized that Valerie was merely an ignorant pawn in Megan's criminal scheme. Confronting her aggressively would accomplish nothing except warning my son and daughter-in-law that I had discovered their latest maneuver. I needed to apply the exact same ruthless corporate negotiation tactics I used to crush rival shipping executives. I needed to keep the enemy talking. I forced a gentle, confused smile onto my face and rubbed my temples as if I were struggling to process her words. I told Valerie that the summer heat was making me feel terribly dizzy and disoriented. I gestured toward the front door and politely invited her inside the house for a cold glass of iced tea so we could sit down and discuss the lovely photographs she planned to use for the sale. Valerie hesitated for a fraction of a second, checking her diamond wristwatch before her greed won out. An exclusive listing on a premium suburban property guaranteed a massive commission check. She eagerly agreed and followed me inside, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a tactical trap. I led her into the kitchen and motioned for her to sit at the island counter. I turned my back to her and opened the refrigerator. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my jacket and retrieved my smartphone. I silently opened the voice memo application and pressed the bright red record button. I slipped the device back into my pocket, ensuring the microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every single syllable spoken in the room. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and set them on the granite counter. I sat down across from Valerie, leaning heavily against the counter to maintain my performance of a frail, confused senior citizen. I took a slow sip of tea and asked her to repeat exactly what Megan had told her regarding the legal authority to sell the house. Valerie, eager to secure her impending commission, happily spelled out the entire fraudulent narrative. She confirmed on the act of recording that Megan explicitly claimed I had granted her full legal authority to manage my real estate portfolio due to my deteriorating mental state. Valerie proudly stated that Megan had provided comprehensive photocopies of the original property deeds to prove the home was free of any outstanding mortgages or liens. I furrowed my brow, acting deeply troubled by my own memory. I asked Valerie if I had personally signed any documents authorizing her agency to sell the house because my mind was terribly foggy lately. I presented myself as a compliant but forgetful old man who simply needed reassurance. Valerie smiled warmly and reached back into her designer tote bag. She eagerly pulled out a crisp, heavy stock document to soothe my manufactured anxiety. She stated that everything was perfectly legal and securely executed. She slid the document across the granite island directly into my hands. It was an exclusive right to sell listing agreement. I looked down at the official paperwork. The contract legally bound the sale of my property to her brokerage firm. I scanned the dense paragraphs until my eyes landed firmly on the bottom signature line. There, resting right next to the current date, was a signature claiming to be mine. I stared at the dark blue ink. It was an absolutely desperate, sloppy forgery. The loops on the letters were entirely wrong. The pen pressure was visibly uneven, demonstrating the hesitation of the person faking the strokes. I had signed my name to thousands of corporate checks and binding legal contracts over my lifetime. My actual signature was a sharp, aggressive testament to my authority. The signature on this real estate contract was a pathetic imitation crafted by a desperate woman trying to steal a house. It was a documented, verifiable felony executed on official paper. I kept my expression entirely blank, hiding the fierce triumph surging through my chest. I slowly slid the contract back across the counter and thanked Valerie for being so patient with an old man. I told her the paperwork looked incredibly official and that I was glad Megan had found such a competent professional to handle the family affairs. I asked her if I could keep a spare copy of the contract just so I could remember the details later. Valerie beamed with professional pride and happily separated a carbon copy from the stack, handing it directly to me. She finished her iced tea, gathered her glossy promotional flyers, and thanked me for my hospitality. I walked her to the front door and watched her drive away in her luxury sedan. The moment her car disappeared around the corner, I reached into my pocket and stopped the audio recording. I looked down at the forged contract in my hand. Megan thought she was exceptionally clever. She thought she could use my age and my wife's tragic medical emergency as a smokescreen to liquidate my assets and pocket the cash. Instead, she had just handed me the definitive physical weapon required to completely destroy her life. I had the forged document. I had the audio confession of the broker detailing Megan lies. I possessed the first piece of undeniable hard criminal evidence. The trap was closing, and they had no idea they were already caught. I arrived back at the intensive care unit just as a deafening medical alarm shattered the quiet hum of the hospital corridor. 3 nurses sprinted past me, pushing a heavy emergency crash cart directly into Evelyn's sterile room. I stood entirely frozen behind the large glass observation window, watching my wife's body arch violently off the mattress in the terrifying grip of a massive seizure. The medical team pinned her shoulders down, shouting rapid clinical orders and injecting clear fluids into her intravenous line to stabilize her flailing limbs. I pressed my palms heavily against the cold glass, feeling a murderous dark rage fighting to break through my carefully maintained composure. The brutal seizure lasted for 2 agonizing, unrelenting minutes before Evelyn finally went limp, sinking deeply back into the white hospital sheets. Dr. Evans emerged from the room a few moments later, wiping sweat from his forehead. His expression was no longer just clinically concerned. It was deeply, intensely suspicious. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into an empty, shadowed alcove completely away from the security cameras and the wandering eyes of the nursing staff. He informed me with absolute gravity that standard cardiovascular failures simply do not trigger violent neurological episodes of that extreme magnitude. He explained that the initial emergency room toxicology screening had barely scratched the surface of what was happening inside her body. The violent seizure strongly indicated the aggressive presence of a highly sophisticated, slow-acting neurotoxin. He stated that whatever my wife ingested was absolutely not common household bleach or a mistaken double dose of standard prescription medication. It was a targeted synthetic compound deliberately designed to ruthlessly attack the central nervous system before systematically shutting down the human heart. Dr. Evans looked at me with absolute unshakable certainty and declared that this medical crisis was not a tragic domestic accident. Someone had deliberately and meticulously introduced a lethal chemical agent into Evelyn's system. I nodded slowly, maintaining a flawless mask of devastated shock, while my tactical mind locked onto the plastic eye drop bottle currently burning a hole in my jacket pocket. I thanked the doctor for his relentless professional dedication and assured him I would cooperate fully with any formal law enforcement investigation. The medical confirmation of a neurotoxin was the exact catalyst I needed. It was time to convert my physical evidence into an undeniable legal weapon against my own son. I excused myself from the clinical alcove and took the desolate service elevator down to the subterranean hospital parking garage. Arthur Pierce had efficiently dispatched a private forensic courier who was currently waiting inside an unmarked black sedan parked near the concrete loading docks. I approached the idling vehicle and handed the sealed plastic evidence bag containing the modified eye drop bottle straight through the open passenger window. I strictly instructed the courier to deliver the package directly to the highly secure independent laboratory Arthur kept on permanent retainer for high-stakes corporate espionage cases. I demanded an expedited comprehensive chemical breakdown regardless of the exorbitant financial cost required to jump the testing line. As the dark sedan sped away into the city traffic, I took a deep, steadying breath and returned to the third-floor intensive care ward. Stepping out of the concrete stairwell, I immediately spotted Darren standing at the primary nurse's station. He was leaning heavily over the high counter, flashing his most charming, charismatic smile at a young attending nurse who seemed completely captivated by his polite demeanor. I stepped quietly behind a towering linen cart to silently observe his sudden, intense interest in hospital medical protocol. Darren pulled a large silver resealable pouch of nutritional powder from his expensive designer messenger bag and slid it smoothly across the counter. He spoke in a soft, convincingly urgent tone that I recognized from his days begging for higher allowances. He told the nurse that his dear mother adhered to a very strict organic dietary regimen, and that her sensitive digestive system absolutely could not handle standard processed hospital food. He firmly and politely instructed the nurse to mix a heavy concentrated dose of this specific powder into a glass of room-temperature water. The absolute second Evelyn regained consciousness. He claimed it was a rare, proprietary electrolyte blend, essential for her immediate physical and neurological recovery. I watched the slick transaction with a cold, sickening clarity forming in my mind. For 35 years, Darren had never once paid the slightest attention to his mother's dietary habits or nutritional needs. He routinely mocked Evelyn for drinking bitter herbal teas instead of consuming expensive imported wines at family dinners. He genuinely did not know the name of a single daily vitamin she consumed to maintain her health. Yet here he was aggressively orchestrating her delicate post-coma nutrition with a highly custom powder blend. The timing of this gesture was entirely too convenient and far too specific. Megan had clearly failed to kill Evelyn at the house with the liquid neurotoxin. Now Darren was stepping in to finish the gruesome job under the deceptive guise of an attentive, caring son, providing holistic dietary support. He gently patted the nurse on the arm, thanked her profusely for her outstanding service, and walked confidently back toward the waiting room, where his deceitful wife was sitting. The young nurse placed the silver pouch on a rolling metal medical tray directly outside Evelyn's room, preparing it for her eventual awakening. My son had just hand-delivered the final lethal dose directly to the medical staff. He was weaponizing the hospital-owned care protocols to effortlessly execute a murder right in front of the authorities. My smartphone vibrated sharply with an encrypted text message from Arthur. The private laboratory had successfully fast-tracked the chemical analysis of the confiscated eye drop bottle. The preliminary results were chillingly conclusive and undeniably lethal. The clear liquid was a heavy industrial-grade synthetic solvent, entirely colorless and completely odorless to the human senses. The specific chemical was explicitly engineered to trigger acute myocardial infarction while leaving virtually no trace in a standard post-mortem medical autopsy. If Evelyn had consumed the entire bottle, her heart would have simply stopped beating, mimicking a natural tragic death perfectly. I slid my phone away and walked briskly toward Evelyn's isolated room. The long hallway was momentarily clear of medical staff due to a mandatory shift rotation briefing. I stepped quickly up to the rolling metal medical tray and snatched Darren's silver pouch. I rapidly dumped the potentially lethal powder into a sterile plastic specimen bag and shoved it deep into my pants pocket. I immediately refilled the silver pouch with standard powdered milk I had grabbed from the cafeteria coffee station, perfectly matching the heavy weight and chalky texture of the original substance. I placed the pouch exactly where the nurse had originally left it. I had successfully neutralized their secondary strike and safely secured the physical poison for independent legal testing. I walked calmly back into the main waiting room just as Dr. Evans approached Darren and Megan. The exhausted doctor smiled, offering the first piece of genuinely good news we had received in 24 hours. He announced that the aggressive intravenous flushing protocols had successfully cleared the absolute worst of the neurotoxins from Evelyn's bloodstream. She had officially and miraculously passed the critical danger window. Dr. Evans confidently stated that Evelyn would likely regain full consciousness within the next 48 hours. I stood perfectly still and watched my son and daughter-in-law receive the medical update. The vibrant color instantly drained from Megan's face, leaving her looking physically ill and entirely panicked. Darren's jaw dropped open, his charismatic, confident facade entirely shattering in real time. They did not cheer for the recovery. They did not hug each other in profound relief. Absolute, unadulterated terror radiated from their widening eyes. Their flawless, calculated murder plot had failed completely. The wealthy, vulnerable victim they desperately tried to eliminate was about to wake up, and she knew exactly who handed her that bitter cup of tea. I watched my son and his wife struggle to process the news of Evelyn's impending recovery. Their united front of fake sorrow immediately fractured under the sudden weight of pure panic. Megan practically ran out of the waiting area, gripping her phone tightly while frantically typing a message. Darren stayed behind, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other, clearly trying to figure out how to handle a mother who could expose his attempted murder. I realized right then that a direct frontal assault would be a massive tactical error. If I confronted them together, they would simply deny everything cover for each other and likely accelerate their efforts to declare me legally incompetent before Evelyn could speak. They were a dangerous unified force when operating under a shared goal. I needed to fundamentally destroy that unity. I needed them to turn their vicious, predatory instincts inward and tear each other apart before I delivered the final crushing blow. I left the hospital knowing Evelyn was heavily guarded by medical staff and safely recovering from the neutralized toxin. I drove straight to the sleek glass office building downtown where Arthur Pierce managed the Hidden Logistics Trust. I walked directly into Arthur's private suite, bypassing his administrative assistant entirely. I told him I needed a precise financial pressure point to break my daughter-in-law hold over my son. Arthur did not ask questions. He understood that my requests were purely tactical. He turned to his secure computer terminal and spent the next hour aggressively tracing the financial footprint of the $50,000 Darren had stolen from my joint account earlier that day. Arthur's meticulous search yielded an absolute goldmine of leverage. He discovered that Megan maintained a completely secret offshore credit card account registered entirely under her maiden name. Darren had absolutely no idea this secondary financial lifeline existed. Arthur printed out the comprehensive transaction history and slid the heavy stack of papers across his mahogany desk. I reviewed the statements with a cold, detached fascination. The financial history perfectly explained a lingering discrepancy that had always bothered me. For the past 3 years, Megan had relentlessly complained about Darren's modest salary as a mid-level marketing manager. She constantly belittled him at family dinners, making sure everyone knew he was failing to provide her with the luxury lifestyle she believed she inherently deserved. Despite her constant complaints about their tight budget, she consistently arrived at our house wearing brand new designer shoes, carrying expensive imported leather handbags, and sporting custom jewelry that Darren could never possibly afford. I had previously assumed she was quietly racking up massive consumer debt on the supplementary cards I paid off every month. The truth was far more sinister and infinitely more useful to my current operation. The offshore credit card statements revealed a distinct pattern of massive, untraceable cash deposits followed immediately by exorbitant spending sprees at high-end boutiques. But the absolute most damaging transactions were not the designer clothes. They were the recurring weekly charges for a premium luxury suite at a discreet boutique hotel located on the absolute opposite side of the city. The most recent charge had been processed just 2 hours ago, utilizing the exact funds Darren had wired into their joint account after stealing it from me. Megan was not just hiding a secret shopping habit. She was aggressively funding a lavish double life, and she was using the money her husband had just stolen from his dying mother to pay for it. I asked Arthur to isolate the most recent hotel receipt and print a high-resolution physical copy. The document clearly displayed Megan's full name alongside the name of a male guest listed as the secondary occupant. The name belonged to a prominent local real estate developer, a man entirely unaffiliated with our family or Darren's social circle. I took the printed receipt, folded it carefully, and placed it securely in my breast pocket. I thanked Arthur for his ruthless efficiency and drove directly back to the hospital. I bypassed the main entrance and navigated my truck deep into the subterranean parking garage. I easily located Darren's expensive luxury sedan parked carelessly across 2 designated visitor spaces. I walked casually up to the vehicle, checking the surrounding area to ensure the concrete level was completely deserted. I pulled the folded hotel receipt from my pocket. I did not want to smash a window or trigger a loud security alarm. I needed the discovery to feel completely organic, like a devastating accident of fate. I noticed the passenger side window was rolled down approximately half an inch, leaving a narrow, visible gap. Darren frequently left it cracked to vent the heat from the leather interior. I slipped the crisp white paper smoothly through the narrow opening, letting it flutter down silently. It landed perfectly face-up directly in the center of the dark leather passenger seat, where it was absolutely impossible to miss. I retreated behind a concrete support pillar and waited in the shadows. 10 minutes later, Darren stormed out of the elevator bank alone. He was aggressively typing on his phone, his face a mask of absolute frustration. He marched up to his car, yanked the driver's side door open, and threw his body into the seat. I watched intently as he reached over to drop his phone onto the passenger side. He froze. His hand hovered in midair over the white piece of paper resting on the dark leather. He slowly picked up the hotel receipt, holding it up to the dim overhead garage light to read the printed text. I could clearly see the exact moment the devastating reality shattered his entire world. The heavy red flush of absolute betrayal flooded his face instantly, replacing his previous frustration with a violent, unhinged fury. He slammed his fist brutally against the steering wheel, screaming a profanity so loud it echoed sharply off the concrete walls. He shoved the key into the ignition, started the engine with a furious roar, and slammed the car into reverse, tearing out of the parking garage at a dangerous speed. The internal bomb had successfully detonated. The alliance was broken. I sat in the dark cab of my truck, parked discreetly 2 streets over from my property, pressing my smartphone hard against my ear. I had planted a highly sensitive audio recording device beneath the heavy oak nightstand of my master bedroom during my brief tactical retreat earlier that evening. The violent slam of the front door echoed sharply through the tiny speaker, followed immediately by Darren's furious, heavy footsteps charging up the wooden staircase. He cornered Megan in the bedroom, and the sound of crumpling paper filled the audio feed. He had thrown the hotel receipt directly at her face. His voice cracked with a volatile mixture of profound betrayal and blinding rage as he demanded a full explanation for the luxury suite and the unidentified male companion listed on the printed folio. I listened with clinical detachment, waiting to hear exactly how my daughter-in-law would navigate the explosive trap I had set. Megan did not stutter. She did not break down in tears or offer a frantic, tearful confession. She executed a masterful psychological pivot, completely shifting her strategy from sudden panic to weaponized indignation. She went on the immediate offensive, her voice rising in a pitch of manufactured outrage. She screamed that the receipt was a blatant forgery, a malicious document manufactured entirely by me. Megan aggressively insisted that I had printed a fake receipt and planted it in his vehicle specifically to destroy their marriage and turn him against his only true ally. She painted me as a bitter, controlling old man, utilizing my extensive corporate resources to systematically isolate him. Darren hesitated. His lifelong habit of submitting to his wife's dominance kicked in, battling against the hard physical evidence currently in his hands. Megan capitalized ruthlessly on his moment of tactical weakness. She lowered her voice, injecting a tone of urgent, conspiratorial fear into the room. She told him that my attempts to frame her proved a terrifying reality. She argued I was not suffering from dementia. I was dangerously lucid, highly observant, and actively plotting against them. She argued that if I possessed the mental clarity to plant fabricated evidence, I was absolutely preparing to strike back legally and financially. She convinced him that their window of opportunity to secure their stolen wealth was closing rapidly. They needed to move the stolen $50,000 out of his domestic checking account immediately before I found a way to freeze his assets or involve the local authorities. Darren swallowed the toxic lie completely. The paralyzing fear of losing the stolen money completely outweighed his lingering suspicion of her infidelity. Their fragile, treacherous alliance reformed instantly under the shared threat of my impending retaliation. They agreed they had to launder the stolen funds before sunrise. I disconnected the live audio feed and immediately dialed Arthur Pierce on my secure prepaid phone. The temporary crack in their alliance had forced them into a state of hyperactive desperation, making them highly predictable. Desperate people make monumental tactical errors when suddenly presented with a seemingly easy escape route. I instructed Arthur to silently lift the security freeze on a specific secondary investment account linked directly to my name. Decades ago, during the turbulent early expansion phase of my logistics company, Evelyn and I navigated intense financial droughts and fended off aggressive corporate raiders. We learned a fundamental, unshakable truth about human nature during those lean, ruthless years. A greedy individual backed into a corner will never refuse a sudden influx of unguarded cash, regardless of how suspiciously convenient the timing might appear. I told Arthur to make the account look completely vulnerable, deliberately leaving a balance of exactly $50,000 exposed to Darren's existing login credentials. This was not a standard savings account holding liquid cash. This specific portfolio was tied directly to a highly monitored, federally regulated government bond fund. I waited in the quiet isolation of my truck, watching the glowing digital clock on my dashboard flip forward minute by minute. I knew Darren was currently sitting on the edge of my bed, frantically refreshing his banking applications on his laptop, desperately searching for any remaining vulnerable assets before he executed his international laundering scheme. He needed more capital to ensure his total financial independence. Less than 20 minutes later, Arthur sent a secure encrypted text message confirming the trap was officially sprung. Darren had successfully logged into the unthought account. He saw the $50,000 sitting there completely unprotected and ready for transfer. Rather than questioning why a previously frozen account was suddenly accessible, his blinding greed took absolute control of his faculties. He bypassed every logical warning sign. He executed an immediate digital transfer, sweeping the entire $50,000 balance directly into his own personal checking account. He had successfully doubled his stolen funds to a total of $100,000 in a matter of seconds. He genuinely believed he had just outsmarted me for a second time. He thought he had successfully plundered the absolute last remaining scraps of his father's wealth. The harsh reality was that I had just handed him a heavy steel anchor right before throwing him into the deepest part of the ocean. He had swallowed the bait whole, and now he urgently needed to hide the massive sum of stolen cash before the banking institutions opened for regular business hours and flagged the irregular domestic transfers. The audio feed from my master bedroom crackled back to life, transmitting the final fatal steps of their conspiracy. Megan took complete command of the financial operation, her voice vibrating with greedy excitement. She explicitly instructed Darren to wire the entire $100,000 to an offshore escrow account located in a Caribbean tax haven. She confidently claimed she had already contacted a shadowy international broker to purchase a luxury vacation villa entirely under her maiden name. She explained that routing the money offshore and converting it into foreign real estate would effectively shield the stolen assets from any domestic civil lawsuits I might attempt to file. Darren eagerly agreed to the illicit plan, the rapid clacking of his laptop keyboard echoing through the speaker as he initiated the international wire transfer. A sharp digital confirmation chime rang out, signaling the completion of the transaction. They let out a collective sigh of immense relief, genuinely believing they had secured their stolen fortune and completely outmaneuvered a helpless old man. They loudly celebrated their brilliant criminal enterprise right in the middle of the house I had built with my own hands. What neither Darren nor Megan understood was the intricate, unforgiving architecture of federal banking regulations. The specific investment account they had just drained was subjected to rigorous, automated governmental oversight. By deliberately transferring a sum exceeding $10,000 from that closely monitored domestic fund directly to an unregistered foreign entity, they automatically triggered a mandatory suspicious activity report under the Bank Secrecy Act. The transaction did not just bypass the desks of local bank managers, it generated an immediate, highly detailed red flag directly within the core tracking systems of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The precise moment Darren clicked confirm on that international wire, he unilaterally elevated his crime from a simple familial theft to a severe, undeniable act of federal wire fraud and international money laundering. The digital footprint was permanent, irrefutable, and entirely visible to federal authorities. Arthur called me back moments later to confirm that the international transfer had cleared the preliminary automated checks, permanently locking the transaction into the federal database. I sat in the darkness, feeling the cold, absolute weight of victory. I had the forged real estate listing contract securely in my possession. I had the audio recording of their conspiracy. I now possessed verified digital proof of a massive federal financial crime executed by my own son. My legal arsenal was absolute and devastating. The walls were rapidly closing in on them from all sides, and they were entirely too busy celebrating their temporary victory to notice the steel cage locking firmly into place. I sat in the dark cabin of my truck, letting the reality of my son committing federal wire fraud wash over me. My phone vibrated again against the center console. The caller identification displayed the private hospital extension for Dr. Evans. I answered immediately. The exhaustion in the doctor voice was completely replaced by a sharp professional urgency. He informed me that the heavy sedation had fully cleared Evelyn's system. My wife had just opened her eyes. I did not waste a single second celebrating in the truck. I started the engine and drove the short distance back to Atlanta General Hospital, breaking several local speed limits along the way. I sprinted through the quiet pre-dawn corridors of the medical center until I reached the third-floor intensive care unit. I pushed past the heavy swinging doors and walked directly into Evelyn's room. The harsh fluorescent lights cast long shadows over the sterile equipment, but the sight before me instantly steadied my racing heart. Evelyn was incredibly pale, and her breathing remained shallow under the plastic oxygen mask. Yet the moment she heard my footsteps, her dark eyes locked onto mine. The physical weakness ravaging her body had not touched her mind. Her gaze was as intensely sharp and fiercely intelligent as the day she successfully audited our first multi-million-dollar logistics contract. She squeezed my hand with a fragile but determined grip. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, feeling a profound wave of relief. That relief instantly mutated into a hyper-vigilant protective instinct. Darren and Megan were currently sitting in my master bedroom, believing they had successfully stolen $100,000 and secured their getaway. If they received any notification from the hospital staff that Evelyn was awake and communicative, they would realize their murder plot was fully exposed. Desperate criminals backed into an absolute corner will eliminate the primary witness by any means necessary. I walked straight out of the room and approached the local police officer stationed near the administrative desk. I leveraged my undeniable authority as the medical proxy and demanded a permanent physical blockade. I instructed the officer to stand directly in front of Evelyn's door. I mandated that absolutely no one except designated medical personnel and myself be allowed to enter. I specifically banned my son and daughter-in-law from coming within 50 feet of her recovery room. The lead detective investigating the toxicology report arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. He carried a digital voice recorder and a heavy notepad, stepping quietly into the room to avoid overwhelming the patient. I stood firmly beside Evelyn's bed, gripping her hand while the detective gently initiated the formal interview. He asked her to walk him through every detail of the morning I departed for the lake. Evelyn spoke in a raspy whisper, but her factual recall was characteristically flawless. She recounted waking up early to water her prized hydrangeas in the front yard. She then walked back into the kitchen to prepare her daily morning supplements. That was when Megan intercepted her. Megan had suddenly offered her a steaming ceramic mug of custom-blended herbal tea. Evelyn paused, her expression tightening with a mixture of regret and lingering physical pain. She explicitly stated to the detective that she absolutely detested her daughter-in-law holistic herbal concoctions. Megan constantly filled our pantry shelves with expensive, bitter-smelling roots and dried leaves she purchased from high-end wellness boutiques. Evelyn found them completely unpalatable and always preferred her standard black coffee. She only accepted the steaming mug that specific morning to suppress a brewing domestic conflict. The night before my fishing trip, Darren and Megan had engaged in a vicious, loud argument over their mounting credit card bills. Their aggressive shouting had echoed down the hallway and disrupted the entire household. Evelyn knew my son was financially drowning, and she wanted to inject a moment of peace into the house before I left for the weekend. She took the mug from Megan's hands simply to pacify her daughter-in-law and avoid triggering another exhausting screaming match in the kitchen. She drank the tea to keep the peace. The detective leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He asked Evelyn to describe exactly what happened next. Evelyn explained that she consumed the entire cup while standing near the kitchen island. She did not even finish washing the ceramic mug before her chest seized violently. The room spun wildly and her legs simply gave out. The last thing she remembered before hitting the hardwood floor was the sound of the glass dropping from her hands. Evelyn took a slow, rattling breath through her oxygen mask and elaborated on the sensory details. She told the detective that the liquid was unnaturally thick. It coated the back of her throat with a harsh metallic residue that burned instantly. She had assumed Megan simply brewed the roots far too long. She forced herself to swallow it quickly just to be polite. That polite gesture nearly ended her life. The detective clicked his pen, verifying the exact sequence of events. The physical mechanism of the attempted murder was now officially on the police record. The detective asked one final crucial question. He needed to know exactly who else was present in the kitchen when the poisoned tea was served. Evelyn gripped my fingers so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her dark eyes filled with a profound, shattering sorrow as she looked directly at me. She turned her head back to the detective and stated clearly that Darren was standing mere feet away. My son was leaning casually against the granite counter, holding his own cup of coffee. He watched his wife hand the toxic brew to his mother. He watched Evelyn lift the mug to her lips. He watched her swallow the fatal dose. He did not issue a warning. He did not try to slap the cup out of her hands. He did not say a single word to stop the execution. He simply stood there and observed his mother ingest a lethal chemical weapon. The absolute complicity of my own flesh and blood was now an established legal fact. Hearing that truth spoken aloud physically hollowed out my chest. The boy I had protected, funded, and loved unconditionally had actively participated in a cold-blooded assassination attempt against the woman who gave him life. My heart shattered completely into 1,000 jagged pieces, but my mind instantly froze into a state of absolute zero. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation evaporated. The detective immediately shut off his voice recorder and stood up. His face hardened into a mask of professional fury. He stated that he had enough probable cause to dispatch a strike team to my residence and arrest Darren and Megan for attempted homicide right this second. I raised my hand and firmly stopped him. I looked the detective in the eye and explained that an immediate arrest would only capture them for the localized poisoning. I outlined the massive federal wire fraud they had just committed by transferring the stolen $100,000 into an offshore Caribbean account. I told the detective that the federal authorities were already mobilizing based on the automated banking alerts. If the local police kicked down the front door now, they would interrupt the federal financial sting. I convinced the detective to coordinate with the federal agencies and wait just a few more hours. I wanted my son and his treacherous wife to believe they had successfully secured their tropical getaway. I wanted them to experience the absolute peak of arrogant victory before we fundamentally destroyed every single aspect of their freedom. The detective agreed to the tactical delay. The final trap was locked. I retreated to a quiet alcove near the hospital elevators, pulling my prepaid cell phone from my pocket. I took a slow, deep breath, consciously draining the fury from my mind and replacing it with the heavy, hollow exhaustion of a defeated man. I dialed Darren's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with defensive anticipation. I did not give him a chance to speak. I let my voice crack, pitching it low and tired like a man whose spirit had finally been crushed under an unbearable weight. I told him I was done fighting. I said the stress of Evelyn's condition and the constant arguments were destroying my remaining health. I explicitly stated that I was ready to sign over the deed to the house and transfer the remaining liquid assets into his name, provided he promised to manage Evelyn's long-term care and leave me in peace. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with predatory calculation. Darren hesitated for a fraction of a second before greed completely overrode his caution. He adopted a tone of magnanimous forgiveness, telling me I was finally making the right decision for the family. He eagerly asked when and where we could finalize the paperwork. I told him I needed to gather my things from the house and requested that he and Megan meet me there in exactly 1 hour to execute the property transfer. I hung up the phone before he could ask any logistical questions. The bait was successfully deployed, and the predators were actively moving toward the trap. I arrived at my property 40 minutes later. I pulled Valerie's for sale sign out of my front lawn and tossed it carelessly into the bushes. I unlocked the front door and walked directly into the living room. I methodically cleared the coffee table of any remaining magazines or decorative items. I wanted the space to feel completely barren, reflecting the exact emotional state I was projecting. I sat down heavily in my worn leather armchair, positioned perfectly to face the front entryway. I did not turn on any additional lights, letting the natural afternoon shadows lengthen across the hardwood floors. Exactly 20 minutes later, the aggressive growl of Darren's luxury sedan echoed in the driveway. The heavy front door swung open, and my son walked in, followed closely by Megan. They had clearly taken the time to dress for the occasion. Darren wore a sharp-tailored sports coat over a crisp button-down shirt, while Megan was adorned in a sleek designer dress, her wrists heavy with gold jewelry. They looked like conquering royalty arriving to officially claim their newly acquired territory. The smug, triumphant smiles plastered across their faces were absolutely sickening. They genuinely believed my sudden capitulation was the ultimate validation of their superior intellect and relentless pressure. They thought they had successfully broken a stubborn old man and were now stepping in to collect the spoils of their psychological war. Darren approached the center of the room, looking around the empty space with a casual, proprietary air. He clapped his hands together, once a sharp, dismissive sound. He asked where the transfer documents were, stating they had dinner reservations and needed to finalize the signatures quickly. Megan stepped up beside him, crossing her arms and tapping her designer heel impatiently against the floorboards. She demanded I produce the physical deed and the notary stamps, claiming she wanted to ensure the paperwork was completely airtight before they assumed financial responsibility for my future care. I remained entirely seated in my armchair. I did not lean forward. I did not offer a trembling hand or a defeated sigh. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and retrieved the folded carbon copy of the exclusive right-to-sell listing agreement that Valerie the broker had eagerly handed me earlier that day. I tossed the document onto the empty coffee table. The thick paper landed with a flat, definitive smack. I told Megan that the only document we needed to discuss was the fraudulent real estate contract she had executed using my forged signature. The triumphant smiles vanished from their faces, instantly replaced by a sudden jarring shock. Darren stared at the contract, his eyes darting frantically between the forged signature and my cold, unblinking gaze. Megan's face drained of color, her confident posture collapsing as she recognized the specific legal form. Darren lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the document. He intended to tear the evidence to shreds, a desperate instinctual reaction to eliminate the physical proof of their felony. Before his fingers could even brush the paper, the heavy wooden door leading to the kitchen swung violently open. Arthur Pierce stepped into the living room, his tailored suit cutting a sharp, authoritative figure. He was not alone. Two broad-shouldered men in plainclothes flanked him, their police badges clearly visible on their belts. Arthur calmly instructed Darren to step away from the table and keep his hands entirely visible. The trap had effectively slammed shut. The illusion of their victory was entirely shattered, replaced by the crushing, undeniable reality of a criminal investigation. Arthur Pierce stood perfectly still, his presence commanding the room alongside the two broad-shouldered plainclothes detectives. He formally introduced the officers from the Financial Crimes Division and stated they possessed a direct warrant to investigate severe real estate fraud and financial exploitation. Darren stared at the forged listing agreement resting on the coffee table. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His aggressive, entitled posture vanished, replaced instantly by the frantic, twitchy movements of a cornered animal. He looked at the hardened expressions of the officers and then looked at his wife. Without a single moment of hesitation, Darren raised his hands in a defensive posture of complete surrender and pointed his index finger directly at Megan. He loudly declared his absolute innocence to the entire room. He told the detectives that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of the real estate listing or the forged signature on the document. Darren claimed Megan handled all the complicated household paperwork and must have executed the fraudulent contract entirely on her own initiative. He painted himself as a naive, grieving son who was simply following his dominant wife instructions to help prepare for his mother's impending medical care. He insisted that Megan had actively manipulated the broker and fabricated the dementia narrative without his consent or participation. He took a wide step away from her, physically distancing himself from the woman he had sworn to protect in front of his family and friends. He begged the police to arrest her, explicitly stating she was the sole calculating architect of the property theft. He completely abandoned his partner the exact second the threat of a state prison sentence materialized in our living room. I watched my son shed every ounce of his supposed loyalty and marital devotion. He was entirely willing to sacrifice his wife to save his own skin. The swiftness of his brutal betrayal was staggering but entirely predictable. He was a fundamental coward who constantly relied on others to do his dirty work. He mistakenly thought throwing Megan to the authorities would magically absolve him of the toxic poison, the stolen cash, and the endless web of lies. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. Megan did not possess a passive, submissive nature. She was a deeply pragmatic, ruthless opportunist who would never go down alone. Megan spun around to face her husband. Her eyes widened with absolute venomous shock before narrowing into slits of pure, unrestrained hatred. The heavy designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor, spilling expensive cosmetics across the planks. For 3 long years, she had quietly tolerated his mediocre career trajectory and his constant desperate need for parental approval strictly because she believed he would eventually inherit a massive, life-changing fortune. Their entire marriage was built on a toxic, hollow foundation of mutual exploitation and deeply anticipated wealth. Now facing the imminent, terrifying reality of a federal indictment, that fragile foundation completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces, Megan unleashed a torrential flood of vicious, unfiltered truth. She stepped aggressively toward Darren, jabbing her manicured finger directly into his chest. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure who could not even successfully execute a basic financial theft without her constant, meticulous guidance. She explicitly told the detectives that Darren was the absolute, undeniable mastermind behind the entire operation to steal the family assets. Megan confessed loudly that Darren had been obsessively planning to drain my bank accounts for 6 grueling months. She detailed how he had systematically researched state power of attorney laws and spent hours scouring the internet for untraceable chemical compounds to use on his own mother. She laid out his crippling personal insecurities, explaining that Darren felt entirely emasculated by my past monumental success in the national logistics industry. He desperately wanted my money to artificially inflate his fragile ego and clear his hidden, mounting personal gambling and consumer debts. Megan made sure the police heard every single damning detail clearly. She admitted to forging the real estate contract, but loudly clarified that Darren had physically provided her with my original property deeds from his stolen emergency fireproof binder. She stated he had explicitly ordered her to expedite the house sale so they could secure offshore passports and flee the country before I inevitably discovered the missing $50,000. She threw his own pathetic cowardice right back in his sweating face, claiming he forced her to deal with the real estate broker because he was too terrified to look me in the eye and negotiate the fraudulent deal himself. The 2 detectives stood quietly, intentionally allowing the suspects to fully incriminate each other on the record. The sheer volume of their mutual explosive confessions provided the authorities with enough probable cause to secure multiple consecutive felony convictions. They were aggressively tearing each other apart, shredding their carefully constructed alibis and exposing the darkest, most twisted corners of their conspiracy. I remained perfectly seated in my worn armchair, watching the spectacular, fiery destruction of their criminal alliance. My calculated strategy had worked flawlessly. By cornering them with undeniable proof of a single undeniable crime, I had triggered a massive chain reaction of panic that caused them to verbally confess to every other offense they had committed. The mutual financial benefit that bound them together had completely evaporated, leaving only frantic self-preservation and profound, visceral hatred. The shouting match between my son and his wife reached a deafening fever pitch. Darren raised his hand, his face contorted with violent, unpredictable rage, screaming that she was nothing but a gold-digging parasite who ruined his life. I decided it was the perfect tactical moment to deliver the absolute final blow to their existence. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and retrieved a small, high-resolution digital tablet I had securely synced to my encrypted home network. I placed it firmly on the center of the coffee table, right next to the forged real estate document. I tapped the glass screen and maximized a clear, high-definition video file. I calmly informed them that I had personally installed hidden motion-activated security cameras in my master bedroom, the exact same day I discovered they had audaciously moved their designer wardrobes into my private space. The video began to play with crisp, undeniable clarity. The silent footage showed Megan standing completely alone in my bedroom. She was holding Darren's expensive monogrammed leather wallet. The hidden camera perfectly captured her pulling a massive, thick stack of $100 bills from the center fold. It was a substantially large portion of the exact $50,000 Darren had stolen from my joint account during Evelyn's terrifying medical crisis. The video clearly showed Megan shoving the stolen cash deep into her luxury purse before aggressively and excitedly texting on her smartphone. I turned the glowing tablet directly toward Darren and calmly explained the context. I told him that his wife had immediately used his freshly stolen money to finance a premium romantic hotel suite for her affluent real estate developer lover. The devastating revelation hit Darren like a physical concussive shockwave. The absolute magnitude of her personal betrayal completely short-circuited his brain. He had risked decades in federal prison to steal that specific money, and she had casually siphoned it away to fund an illicit ongoing affair. Darren let out a primal, guttural scream that tore through his throat. He completely lost his mind. He lunged forward with terrifying speed and wrapped both of his hands violently around Megan's slender throat. The brutal force of his sudden attack sent them crashing backward heavily into the drywall. Megan gasped desperately for air, clawing frantically at his face and arms. The two plainclothes detectives reacted instantly to the sudden violence. They charged across the room, tackling Darren aggressively to the floor and forcefully prying his tightening hands off his wife's neck. They slammed him face down onto the hard wooden planks, snapping heavy metal handcuffs securely around his wrists. A second officer pulled a gasping, sobbing Megan to her feet and immediately secured her arms tightly behind her back. Arthur Pierce stood silently beside me, watching the police drag my son and daughter-in-law out of my house. They had systematically destroyed themselves exactly as I had coldly calculated. I sat quietly in my armchair, listening to the wail of approaching police sirens, knowing the ruthless purging of my family was finally complete. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Megan's wrists, securing her arms tightly behind her back. The sudden cold reality of physical restraint did not silence her. Instead, it ignited a volatile, arrogant defiance. She twisted her shoulders violently, shrugging off the arresting officer grip, and glared at me with absolute, unfiltered hatred. The physical danger from Darren's sudden attack had passed, but her mind immediately pivoted back to her perceived financial and legal superiority. Megan screamed that this pathetic police ambush meant absolutely nothing. She confidently declared that she was already miles ahead of my amateur traps. She threw her head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed awkwardly in the otherwise silent living room. She loudly reminded everyone present that she had successfully wired the stolen fortune directly into a secure, untouchable offshore account in the Caribbean. She boasted that local municipal law enforcement had absolutely zero jurisdiction over international banking havens. She locked eyes with me and promised to use every single cent of that offshore money to hire the most ruthless, aggressive defense attorney in the entire state. She vowed to sue me for entrapment, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She explicitly threatened to drag my name and my remaining businesses through a brutal, humiliating public trial until I was left with nothing but legal fees. She even taunted me about Evelyn, claiming that the impending stress of a massive public lawsuit would surely finish my wife off. She stated that her offshore broker was already securing the title to a private coastal villa where favorable extradition laws would protect her permanently. She then turned her venomous gaze toward Darren, who was currently pinned face down to the floor by the second detective. She mocked his complete incompetence, laughing at his current physical submission. She spat out that she would be relaxing on a tropical beach by tomorrow evening, while he rotted in a county jail cell, relying on an overworked, underpaid public defender. She genuinely believed her international wire transfer was a flawless, impenetrable shield against any domestic legal consequences. She stood in my living room, handcuffed and facing multiple felony charges, yet she remained entirely convinced that her stolen wealth made her completely invincible. She believed the speed of her digital theft had simply outpaced my analog methods of control. Her sheer arrogance blinded her to the very obvious presence of my corporate attorney standing quietly just a few feet away. Arthur Pierce stepped forward, his polished leather shoes making soft, deliberate sounds against the hardwood floor. He did not match Megan's aggressive volume. He maintained the quiet, lethal composure of a man who held all the execution codes. He unlatched his premium leather briefcase and withdrew a crisp, official manila folder. He looked directly at Megan, his expression radiating a profound clinical pity. He calmly informed her that a fundamental lack of financial literacy is always the fatal flaw of the short-term greedy. During the rapid, aggressive expansion of our national logistics empire decades ago, Evelyn and I learned a vital lesson about wealth preservation. We observed countless newly rich contractors and overly ambitious executives destroy their own fortunes because they fundamentally failed to understand the complex architecture of federal tax liabilities. They saw raw cash and assumed it was immediately spendable. We realized that true generational wealth requires rigid structural safeguards. Consequently, Evelyn intentionally tied our most liquid investment vehicles to highly regulated tax-deferred government bonds. She classified this specific fund as a generation-skipping trust with severe penalty clauses for early or unverified withdrawal. We built invisible, impenetrable walls around our money that required precise, methodical regulatory compliance to breach safely. Darren and Megan possessed absolutely zero comprehension of these sophisticated financial structures. They were accustomed to swiping supplementary credit cards and waiting for me to blindly pay the monthly balances. When Darren logged into my account and eagerly transferred that initial $50,000 bait, he did not just move simple cash. He interacted with a highly sensitive, strictly monitored federal investment portfolio. Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and presented a detailed financial flow chart. He explained that navigating those specific accounts required filing comprehensive domestic tax declarations before moving a single dollar. Darren had bypassed the standard security questions, entirely unaware that the real security was the massive tax liability itself. Megan's arrogant sneer began to falter. Arthur clarified that by failing to execute the mandatory domestic paperwork, they had already violated basic banking compliance. But their truly fatal mistake occurred when Megan ordered Darren to immediately wire that entire combined sum directly to a foreign unregistered entity. They thought they were laundering the money and placing it far beyond my reach. They believed the Caribbean destination guaranteed total financial immunity. They completely ignored the invisible, heavily weaponized tripwires surrounding the transaction. They acted with the reckless, blind entitlement of thieves who had never actually earned the money they were desperately trying to steal. Arthur slowly turned the pages of the folder, revealing official documents stamped with the bold insignia of the federal government. He told Megan that her offshore broker was nothing more than a giant red flag waving directly at federal auditors. Arthur meticulously detailed the devastating federal consequences of their international wire transfer. He explained that aggressively moving capital from that specific tax-advantaged investment fund directly to a foreign entity without prior Internal Revenue Service clearance automatically bypassed mandatory federal withholding taxes. This reckless action immediately categorized the entire transaction as felony tax evasion and international money laundering under strict federal statutes. The federal banking algorithms do not wait for local court orders or domestic police warrants. They strike with immediate automated prejudice. Arthur pulled a final certified document from the folder and held it up for Megan to read. He revealed that at exactly 6:00 this morning, the federal government officially executed a comprehensive financial freeze. The authorities had placed a permanent, impenetrable lock on every single domestic and international account bearing either of their names. The Caribbean bank had immediately complied with the international federal warrant to seize the offshore funds. Arthur's voice remained steady as he outlined the specific financial penalties. The mandatory fines for attempting to bypass the withholding taxes were calculated at 3 times the original transferred amount. The Internal Revenue Service had already filed a massive federal lien against their future earnings. Megan realized she was not just broke today, she was permanently indentured to the federal government for the rest of her natural life. Arthur looked at her with absolute unwavering finality. He stated clearly that she could not access the offshore villa money. She could not access her domestic checking accounts. She could not even access the loose change in her personal savings. They were entirely, utterly destitute. They did not have a single accessible cent to their names. They would not be hiring premium defense attorneys or posting expensive cash bails. They would be entirely at the mercy of the public defender system. The arrogant, triumphant mask completely dissolved from Megan's face. The crushing reality of total financial ruin and impending prolonged federal imprisonment finally shattered her delusions. The color drained from her lips and she looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Her knees buckled and she went entirely limp, forcing the arresting officer to aggressively haul her back up by her shoulders. The officer gripped her biceps and marched her forcefully down the hallway. Her designer heels scraped harshly against the floorboards as she was dragged toward the exit. As the officers pushed her out onto the front porch, the flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars illuminated her tear-streaked, terrified face. Megan let out a visceral, agonizing scream of pure despair. The desperate, terrifying sound echoed violently across my quiet suburban lawn as she was forcefully thrown into the back of the waiting police cruiser. The heavy metal handcuffs binding Darren's wrists forced his shoulders into an awkward, unnatural angle as the detectives wrestled him fully to the hardwood floor. He fought against their grip not with the aggressive defiance Megan had displayed, but with the frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of a man watching his entire life disintegrate. The physical restraint completely broke him. Darren's legs gave out entirely, and he collapsed hard onto his knees directly in front of the armchair where I was sitting. He stared up at me, his face slick with sweat and streaked with tears, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He did not look like the confident marketing manager who had effortlessly lied to the hospital psychiatrist just hours ago. He looked like the terrified 10-year-old boy who used to hide behind my legs during summer thunderstorms. He began to beg. His voice cracked and wavered, shattering the quiet authority of the living room. He pleaded with me to intervene, to use my immense wealth and my formidable influence to call off the detectives. He cried out that he was my only son, my flesh and blood, and that I could not possibly allow him to be locked away in a federal penitentiary. He weaponized our shared history, throwing decades of family memories at my feet in a desperate attempt to spark my paternal mercy. He reminded me of the weekends I spent teaching him how to rebuild the carburetor on my first delivery truck. He recalled the pride in Evelyn's eyes when he graduated from university. He tried to rebuild the bridge he had just spent 6 months aggressively burning down, completely ignoring the massive pile of ashes surrounding us both. He wanted me to forget the forged real estate contracts, the stolen $50,000, and the calculated psychiatric manipulations simply because we shared a last name. I sat perfectly still, looking down at him. I felt no anger, no sorrow, no lingering trace of parental obligation. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard reality of the situation he had engineered. I let his pathetic pleas hang in the air, allowing the detectives and Arthur Pierce to witness the absolute depths of his cowardice. Darren realized his appeals to family loyalty were bouncing off an impenetrable wall of ice. He desperately needed a new strategy to save himself from the impending felony charges. Darren shifted his gaze violently away from me and focused his terror entirely onto the doorway where the officers had just dragged his screaming wife. He launched into a frantic, disjointed monologue, completely rewriting the narrative of their conspiracy to cast himself as the ultimate victim. He loudly proclaimed that Megan was a master manipulator, a psychological predator who had systematically poisoned his mind against his own parents. He swore to the detectives that he had never possessed the ambition or the intelligence to execute such a complex financial crime on his own. He claimed Megan constantly belittled his salary and relentlessly pressured him to secure an early inheritance by any means necessary. He painted a pathetic picture of a weak, henpecked husband who was bullied into compliance by a dominant, greedy spouse. He insisted that she research the offshore accounts, forged the signatures on the property deeds, and orchestrated the entire real estate fraud while he merely followed her aggressive orders in a misguided attempt to save his failing marriage. He essentially argued that his profound lack of moral character was entirely her fault. I watched him effortlessly discard the woman he had chosen to marry, the woman he had actively conspired with to steal my fortune. During the grueling early years of building my logistics empire, I encountered countless weak men who blamed their spectacular failures on their business partners or the fluctuating market. Evelyn and I built our success on the bedrock principle of absolute personal accountability. We never made excuses for our missteps, and we certainly never tolerated subordinates who refused to own their actions. Darren was actively demonstrating the exact opposite of everything we had painstakingly tried to teach him. He was offering up his wife as a sacrificial lamb, hoping the authorities would be satisfied with her conviction and somehow grant him immunity for his sheer incompetence. He failed to understand that complicity is not a valid legal or moral defense. He stood by silently and facilitated every single act of treachery, securely pocketing the stolen cash and planning his tropical escape with the exact same enthusiasm she possessed. His sudden, frantic attempts to distance himself from the conspiracy only highlighted the profound, unfixable rot at the very core of his character. He was not a victim of psychological manipulation. He was a willing, enthusiastic participant who simply lacked the courage to accept the consequences of his own calculated greed. I slowly stood up from the leather armchair, looking down at the man kneeling on my living room floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a dramatic speech about betrayal or broken hearts. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved the sterile plastic specimen bag containing the silver nutritional pouch. I had kept the pouch securely hidden since I intercepted it at the intensive care unit nurses' station. I held the bag up by the corner, letting the heavy silver package swing slightly in the ambient light. Darren's eyes locked onto the pouch, and the frantic stream of excuses pouring from his mouth ceased instantly. The last remaining drops of color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He recognized the specific packaging immediately. He knew exactly what it contained, and he knew exactly how I had acquired it. I did not need to explicitly state that the independent laboratory had already confirmed the presence of a lethal synthetic neurotoxin mixed perfectly into the powder. His absolute silence was a total, comprehensive confession. I dropped the plastic bag. The heavy silver pouch landed with a sharp, definitive slap against the polished hardwood floor, coming to rest mere inches from his trembling knees. The physical evidence of his attempted murder sat right between us, an insurmountable barrier that no amount of tears or frantic apologies could ever breach. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and delivered my final judgment with absolute, chilling clarity. I told him that any remaining bond of blood completely evaporated the exact second he stood in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee and silently watched his wife hand his mother a fatal cup of poisoned tea. I turned my back on him. I did not watch the detectives haul him aggressively to his feet. I did not listen to his final broken sobs as they dragged him out the front door and down the porch steps toward the waiting squad cars. I walked deliberately toward the kitchen, focusing entirely on the profound silence settling over the house. The intense, necessary purge was officially complete, and the toxic infection that had threatened to destroy everything Evelyn and I had built was finally eradicated. I stood alone in the center of the home I had constructed with my own hands, knowing the hardest part of the war was over, and the crucial work of rebuilding could finally begin. The wail of the police sirens faded into the distance, leaving my house entirely occupied by the clinical efficiency of the local crime scene unit. Two detectives wearing blue latex gloves began systematically cataloging the physical evidence scattered across the living room. One officer carefully placed the forged real estate listing contract into a secure plastic evidence bag, logging the exact time and location of its recovery. Another detective walked upstairs to the master bedroom to formally photograph the designer clothing and personal effects my son and daughter-in-law had audaciously moved into my private sanctuary. I stood near the kitchen island, watching the authorities meticulously dismantle the physical remnants of Darren and Megan treachery. The lead detective approached me holding a thick clipboard. He confirmed that based on the undeniable audio recordings, the forged property documents, and the coordinated federal banking alerts, they had officially established enough probable cause to file multiple felony indictments. Darren and Megan were currently being booked into the county holding facility on charges of attempted murder, large-scale financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. The detective assured me that given the overwhelming volume of hard evidence, neither of them would be securing a sudden release or an easy plea bargain. I nodded, expressing my gratitude for their swift professional response. The tactical operation I had orchestrated was completely successful, but the immediate aftermath required rapid stabilization. My home was a crime scene, and the quiet suburban street outside my front window was rapidly transforming into a chaotic public spectacle. The flashing lights of the police cruisers had inevitably attracted the aggressive attention of the local news media. 3 large broadcasting vans were already parked haphazardly along the curb of my cul-de-sac, their heavy satellite dishes extending into the early evening sky. A small army of reporters and camera operators crowded aggressively against the yellow police tape currently blocking my driveway. They were actively shouting questions toward the house, desperately trying to secure a sensational soundbite regarding the affluent suburban couple arrested for attempting to murder their own mother. I stepped out onto the front porch, ignoring the sudden blinding flashes of the camera lenses. I walked deliberately across the damp grass toward the heavy wooden stake still driven deeply into my front lawn. I gripped the thick wooden post of Valerie the Broker exclusive real estate sign. I planted my feet firmly and pulled upward with a sudden, forceful heave. The damp soil yielded and the sign came completely loose. I threw the heavy wooden board carelessly onto the concrete driveway, the loud clatter silencing the shouting reporters for a fraction of a second. I built this house brick by brick, pouring my own sweat into the foundation, while Evelyn managed our growing trucking business from a cramped folding table in the basement. This property was a sacred testament to our shared survival and relentless ambition. It was not a disposable asset meant to be liquidated by 2 greedy parasites looking to fund an offshore vacation. Tearing that sign out of the earth was the final necessary act of reclaiming my absolute sovereignty over my own home. The reporters immediately surged forward, pressing aggressively against the yellow police tape, holding their microphones high in the air. A woman in a bright red blazer shouted over the chaotic noise, asking for my direct comment regarding the shocking arrest of my only son. Another reporter yelled out, asking if I intended to pursue a civil lawsuit against the real estate brokerage that facilitated the fraudulent listing. I stopped at the edge of the driveway and looked at the desperate, hungry faces of the local media. I felt no desire to explain my tactical maneuvers or perform my grief for the evening news broadcast. I turned my back on the cameras and walked back toward the front porch. I pulled my prepaid phone from my pocket and called Arthur Pierce. I explicitly instructed him to assume total, absolute control over all media relations and incoming legal inquiries. I authorized him to draft a single terse public statement confirming our full cooperation with the federal authorities while strictly declining any further comment. I told Arthur to deploy his most aggressive litigation team to handle the complex bureaucratic fallout of the federal asset freeze and the pending criminal trials. I completely delegated the exhausting mechanics of vengeance so I could focus entirely on the only objective that truly mattered. I retrieved my keys from the kitchen counter and walked out the back door, bypassing the media circus entirely. I drove my truck straight to a quiet floral boutique located on the opposite side of town. I carefully selected 24 long-stemmed, deep red roses. It was the exact same variety of flower Evelyn carried in her bouquet on the stiflingly hot July afternoon we were married 45 years ago. I placed the vibrant bouquet carefully on the passenger seat and steered my truck back toward Atlanta General Hospital. The brutal, necessary war was officially over, and it was time to return to my wife. I walked through the quiet corridors of the hospital's specialized recovery wing, the heavy scent of antiseptic replaced by the soft, comforting aroma of the deep red roses in my hand. The frantic energy of the intensive care unit was entirely absent here. I approached Evelyn's room and pushed the heavy wooden door open slowly. She was sitting upright, propped against a stack of crisp white pillows. Her skin had lost that terrifying translucent pallor, and a faint, healthy warmth had returned to her cheeks. She looked frail, but the absolute clarity in her dark eyes told me her mind was entirely intact. When she saw me holding the bouquet, a soft, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the exact same smile that had anchored me through 45 years of marriage, through the grueling early days of building our logistics company, and through the devastating betrayal we had just survived. I walked to her bedside and placed the roses carefully on the small rolling table. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over me. The storm had officially passed, and we were both still standing. Evelyn reached out and took my hand, her grip weak but insistent. She looked at me, her expression shifting from relief to a hesitant, agonizing sorrow. She asked me in a voice barely above a whisper what had happened to our son. I looked into the eyes of the woman who had spent 35 years fiercely protecting and loving a boy who ultimately tried to destroy her. I knew she was silently hoping for some mitigating circumstance, some shred of evidence that Darren had been entirely manipulated by his wife, or that his actions were born from a sudden, uncharacteristic panic rather than calculated malice. She was desperately clinging to the very last frayed thread of maternal instinct. I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. I knew I had to shatter that illusion completely. During the decades we spent building our business empire, Evelyn and I survived by facing brutal financial realities head-on. We never sugar-coated massive losses or ignored systemic failures within our company. We survived by confronting the absolute unfiltered truth. I owed my wife nothing less than that exact same brutal honesty now. I held her hand firmly and began to systematically recount the events of the past 24 hours. I did not raise my voice, and I did not inject any unnecessary dramatic flair into the narrative. I delivered the facts with cold, unwavering precision. I told her about the $50,000 Darren stole while she was suffocating on the kitchen floor. I detailed the forged real estate listing contract and their aggressive plan to liquidate our home while forcefully committing me to a psychiatric facility. I explained how Megan had utilized the stolen funds to finance a luxury hotel suite for her lover, and how Darren had ultimately attempted to physically strangle his own wife when he discovered her betrayal. Finally, I told Evelyn about the offshore wire transfer and the severe federal indictments they were currently facing. I did not omit a single agonizing detail. I watched a solitary tear spill over Evelyn's eyelashes and trace a slow, devastating path down her cheek. The profound heartbreak of a mother realizing her child is entirely devoid of a soul was agonizing to witness. Yet she did not pull her hand away from mine. She did not attempt to defend him or offer pathetic excuses for his monstrous behavior. She simply closed her eyes, absorbing the brutal, undeniable reality of his choices. Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at me with a hardened, unbreakable resolve. The momentary sorrow had evaporated, replaced by the exact same ruthless clarity that made her a terrifying negotiator in the boardroom. She tightened her grip on my fingers and nodded slowly. We both understood the unspoken reality resting heavily between us. Darren was no longer a misguided son requiring parental guidance. He was a lethal, toxic infection that had nearly killed us both. We silently agreed that the only way to ensure our mutual survival was to completely amputate him from our lives. As if validating our silent pact, my smartphone vibrated sharply in my jacket pocket. I pulled the device out and read a concise, secure text message from Arthur Pierce. The message confirmed that the presiding judge had reviewed the overwhelming volume of physical and audio evidence and officially denied bail for both Darren and Megan. They were deemed severe flight risks due to the international wire transfer and were currently remanded to county custody pending a federal trial. I looked at Evelyn and relayed the information. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping as the final, lingering tension left her body. The calculated, silent adjustment was absolutely complete. The predators were securely locked away, and the sanctuary we had built together was finally safe. Exactly 6 months had passed since the flashing red and blue police lights illuminated my front lawn and systematically removed the toxic infection from our lives. The heavy grinding machinery of the federal justice system moved with a ruthless, unstoppable efficiency, entirely guided by the flawless legal groundwork laid out by Arthur Pierce. The criminal trial was not a drawn-out, dramatic spectacle. It was a swift, clinical dismantling of two incredibly arrogant predators who thought they were smarter than the authorities. Confronted with the insurmountable mountain of high-definition video surveillance, crystal-clear audio confessions, and irrefutable digital banking footprints, their overworked public defenders immediately advised them to surrender. Darren and Megan faced a terrifying reality. They were formally indicted on multiple severe charges, including attempted murder in the first-degree large-scale financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and international wire fraud. The presiding federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency during the sentencing hearing. He looked down from his elevated bench and explicitly condemned their actions as a vile, calculated betrayal of the most sacred familial trust. Darren received a staggering 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Megan, identified clearly on the audio recordings as the aggressive architect of the offshore financial scheme, and the one who physically served the poison tea, received 25 years without the possibility of early parole. The criminal convictions were only the beginning of their absolute ruin. The Internal Revenue Service moved with predatory speed to reclaim the massive tax liabilities triggered by their illicit international transfer. The federal authorities officially seized the offshore Caribbean account. They immediately liquidated the luxury vacation villa Megan had attempted to purchase under her maiden name. The government confiscated every single domestic asset, aggressively stripping them of their designer wardrobes, their luxury vehicles, and the remaining balances in their checking accounts to satisfy the exorbitant financial penalties. They were left entirely destitute, drowning in an insurmountable ocean of legal debt and federal liens that would follow them until the day they died. They had gambled their entire existence for a shortcut to unearned wealth and lost absolutely everything, trading their affluent suburban lifestyle for the cold, unforgiving reality of a concrete prison cell. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow across the freshly manicured lawn of our suburban home. The air was crisp and entirely still. I sat comfortably next to Evelyn on our familiar wooden porch swing, the gentle back-and-forth motion creating a soothing, rhythmic creak against the floorboards. I held a steaming mug of black coffee while Evelyn cradled a delicate porcelain cup filled with her favorite chamomile blend. There was no bitter metallic residue in her cup today. There were no hidden chemical compounds, no manufactured domestic crises, and absolutely no manipulative predators lurking in the shadows of our hallway. The suffocating atmosphere of calculated deceit that had previously infected our home was completely eradicated. Evelyn leaned her head gently against my shoulder, taking a slow, deep breath of the clean evening air. The brutal physical toll of the neurotoxin had entirely faded from her body. Her skin glowed with renewed vitality, and her brilliant mind remained as sharp and commanding as the day we first launched our business. Decades ago, when we were desperately building our logistics empire from the ground up, we believed that accumulating massive financial wealth was the ultimate shield against the world. We sacrificed our time, our energy, and our sleep to ensure our family would never experience the biting sting of poverty. We constructed a $12 million fortress of assets, assuming it would guarantee our safety. However, the ultimate painful lesson we learned from our own son was that true security cannot be deposited in a bank. We learned to rediscover profound joy in the absolute simplest elements of our existence. The authentic value of our lives was not measured by the size of our hidden trust fund or the square footage of our property. It was measured by the quiet, undeniable peace of sitting together on a wooden swing without constantly looking over our shoulders. We had survived the ultimate test of trust and betrayal, emerging with a fortified, unbreakable bond. The silence between us was no longer heavy with unspoken suspicions. It was light, comfortable, and deeply reassuring. We had successfully purged the poison from our home and our hearts, leaving only the unshakable foundation of our 45-year marriage. The serenity of the afternoon stood in sharp contrast to a brief solitary moment I experienced earlier that morning. I had walked down the paved driveway to retrieve the Daily Mail from the brick column at the edge of the street. Nestled between the standard utility bills and grocery store circulars was a cheap, thin, crumpled white envelope. The return address, printed in the top left corner, bore the official stamp of a state correctional facility. Below the stamp, written in faint blue ink, was the specific federal inmate identification number assigned to Darren. I held the flimsy envelope in my hand and slowly traced my eyes over the slanted, uneven handwriting spelling out my name. It was a highly familiar, distinct script. 40 years ago, I had spent countless evenings sitting at our old kitchen table, patiently guiding his small, uncoordinated hand, teaching him how to properly form those exact letters. I taught him how to write his own name with pride and dignity. I stared at the envelope, actively searching my own chest for any lingering emotional resonance. I waited for a familiar pang of paternal sorrow, a flash of lingering anger, or even a fleeting second of regret. I felt absolutely nothing. My chest was entirely hollow regarding the man sitting in that prison cell. The blood tie had been permanently severed the exact moment he stood in my kitchen and watched his wife hand a lethal dose of poison to his mother. I did not waste a single second tearing the envelope open to read his desperate, manipulative apologies. I did not care about his profound regrets or his pathetic pleas for financial assistance from the prison commissary. I turned around and walked purposefully back inside the house. I stepped directly into the living room where a bright, warm fire was already roaring in the stone fireplace to combat the morning chill. Without breaking my stride and without a single moment of hesitation, I tossed the unopened envelope directly into the center of the blazing logs. The cheap paper curled instantly under the intense heat. The edges blackened and ignited the bright orange flames, quickly consuming the ink, the inmate number, and the final desperate words of a treacherous son. Within seconds, the dark, toxic past was completely reduced to a pile of gray, unrecognizable ash floating up the chimney. I turned my back on the fireplace and walked outside to the front porch, letting the screen door click shut behind me. I sat down on the wooden swing, reaching over to firmly grasp Evelyn's warm hand. I looked at the beautiful, resilient woman sitting beside me and smiled with a profound, absolute sense of tranquility. The silent adjustment was brilliantly, flawlessly completed. Our sanctuary was permanently restored, not through loud, chaotic vengeance, but through the quiet, unstoppable power of the truth and the unwavering courage to enforce it. The predators were vanquished, and we were finally truly free. The seasons have changed 5 times since the gavel fell and the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom closed on my son forever. Evelyn and I still live in the house I built with my own hands. We still drink our coffee on the front porch. The physical structures of our life remain entirely unchanged. However, the fundamental philosophy governing our existence has been radically rewritten. During the decades we spent constructing a massive logistics empire from a single delivery truck, we operated under a deeply flawed assumption. We believed that unconditional love meant providing an impenetrable financial shield for our child. We thought that by removing the grueling obstacles we faced as young African-American entrepreneurs, we were giving Darren the ultimate gift of freedom. We were completely wrong. The most profound and devastating lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood is merely a biological coincidence. It is not a binding moral contract, and it absolutely does not guarantee loyalty. Society conditions us to believe that family must be preserved at all costs. We are taught to endure disrespect, financial exploitation, and even psychological abuse simply because the perpetrator shares our last name. That is a dangerous, toxic lie. Giving someone a free pass to destroy your peace of mind out of a misplaced sense of parental obligation is not love. It is active self-destruction. By handing our son a platinum credit card and a life completely devoid of real consequences, we did not protect him from the world. We actively cultivated a predator. We taught him that he was inherently entitled to the fruits of our agonizing labor without ever requiring him to plant a single seed. Wealth decoupled from character and hard work inevitably mutates into a lethal breed of arrogance. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the $12 million safely secured in our blind trust. Real security is not found in high-yield municipal bonds or offshore accounts. Genuine security is the absolute certainty that the person sleeping next to you is not silently calculating the exact date of your demise. It is the quiet, unshakable peace of a home completely purged of manipulation. Evelyn and I survived a coordinated assassination attempt executed by the very people we were actively funding. Surviving that level of intimate betrayal required a brutal, terrifying amputation. We had to take a surgical blade to our own family tree and sever a diseased branch to save the roots. Many people ask how I can live with the knowledge that my only child is rotting in a federal penitentiary. My answer is always the exact same. I sleep perfectly well because the man in that prison cell is a complete stranger who simply wore the face of the boy I once loved. Forgiveness is a concept meant for mistakes, not for calculated malice. I do not harbor burning anger or vengeful thoughts toward Darren or Megan. I simply feel nothing toward them at all. They are erased from our ledger entirely. Evelyn and I now dedicate our considerable resources to funding educational scholarships for young minority entrepreneurs who actually understand the sacred value of hard work. We invest our money into the future rather than feeding the insatiable black hole of familial greed. We learned that the ultimate demonstration of self-respect is the willingness to walk away from anyone who views your life as an obstacle to their inheritance. You owe nobody your sanity, your safety, or your fortune. You only owe yourself the courage to enforce your boundaries. If you found value in this story about surviving family betrayal and reclaiming your power, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments how you have established boundaries in your own life.